Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Nightmare Narratives. I can picture some of you already in bed, maybe some of you just getting home from work. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, I'm glad you're here. If this helps you relax or sleep, please like and subscribe. It means a lot. Now let's get you comfortable, and I'll tell you tonight's story. My name is Michael Ridgemont, and I've been a ranger in the George Washington National Forest for 17 years. I've seen things in these mountains that would make most people pack up and move to the city, but nothing prepared me for what I found on Devil's Backbone Ridge in March of 1991. Let me tell you something about being a backcountry ranger. It's not like the movies. Most days I'm dealing with lost hikers, illegal campfires, and the occasional marijuana grow operation. I carry a radio that works maybe half the time, a .357 revolver, and enough supplies to last 3 days if things go wrong. Before this job, I spent 8 years as a sheriff's deputy, so I know how to handle myself. I thought I'd seen everything. Devil's Backbone is a nasty piece of wilderness. 23 miles from the nearest paved road, with ridges so steep you need ropes to get down some of them. The locals have stories about that area going back generations. They talk about families who went up there during the Civil War and never came back down. Old-timers claim there are people still living in those hills, cut off from the world for over a century. I never believed any of it. Mountain folk love their ghost stories, especially when they're trying to keep outsiders away from their moonshine stills. The call came in on a Tuesday morning. A college kid named Danny Marsh had been backpacking alone in the Devil's Backbone area. He stumbled into the ranger station 3 days later, looking like he'd seen the devil himself. His clothes were torn, he had scratches all over his arms, and his hands shook so bad he could barely hold a coffee cup. "There's people up there," he kept saying, "living in caves. They ain't right, sir. Something's wrong with them." Danny was a senior at Virginia Tech studying biology. Smart kid, not the type to make things up. He showed me on the map where he had been camping up near Widow's Gap, said he'd followed a creek down into a holler he'd never seen marked on any map. "I was looking for water," he explained. "Found this clearing with old buildings, but they weren't abandoned. People were living there, a whole family, men, women, children, but they—" He stopped talking and stared at his hands. They looked wrong, like they'd been living wild for generations. I took down his statement, but I figured it was probably just some survivalist family squatting on federal land. Happens more than you'd think. People get fed up with modern life and try to disappear into the wilderness. Usually doesn't work out too well. But something about Danny's story bothered me. The way he described the location, how scared he was, the specific details about the buildings. He wasn't making this up. 3 days later, I loaded my pack and headed up to Devil's Backbone. The weather was nasty, late winter thaw turning all the trails into muddy soup. Fog rolled in thick as soup by afternoon, and I could barely see 10 feet in any direction. Perfect weather for getting lost. I found Danny's campsite easily enough. Kid was a good camper, left no trace except for the fire ring. From there, I followed the creek he'd mentioned, working my way deeper into country I'd never explored. The map showed nothing but contour lines and the word wilderness. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it got. In 17 years of ranging, I'd learned to read the forest like a book. Birds tell you when predators are around. Squirrels chatter when they're comfortable. Insects make noise when everything's normal. This place was dead silent. Even my footsteps seemed muffled, like the fog was swallowing every sound. The creek bubbled along beside me, but it sounded distant, like I was hearing it through cotton. I stopped every few minutes to listen, thinking maybe I'd hear voices or dogs barking or something that would tell me people were nearby. Nothing. Around 4 in the afternoon, I found the clearing Danny had described. It was bigger than I'd expected, maybe 3 acres of flat ground in a bowl between 2 ridges. There were buildings all right, but they were like nothing I'd ever seen. The main structure was built from logs, but not cut logs. These were whole trees, bark still on them, fitted together with mud and moss chinking. No windows that I could see, just gaps between the logs. The roof was made from bark slabs held down with rocks. There was a chimney, but it was just stacked stones with no mortar. Around the main building were smaller structures, lean-tos, dugouts, what looked like root cellars dug into the hillside. Everything was built from materials you could find right there in the forest. No nails, no metal, no modern materials at all. But the strangest thing was how old it all looked. Not falling down old, but worn smooth by decades of use. The path between buildings was packed hard as concrete from generations of footsteps. Stones around the fire pit were blackened by thousands of cooking fires. This wasn't some survivalist camp. This was a settlement that had been here for a very long time. I spent about an hour looking around the clearing, trying to figure out if anyone was home. The buildings were clearly lived in. I could see fresh ashes in the fire pit, and there were tools scattered around. But they weren't tools I recognized. Everything was made from bone, stone, and wood. Knives with deer antler handles and blades that looked like they'd been knapped from flint. Bowls carved from tree burls. What looked like needles made from bird bones. Even their cooking pots were carved from stone. It was like stepping back in time 200 years. I called out a few times, "Hello, Forest Service," but got no answer. The silence was getting to me. I've spent plenty of nights alone in the wilderness, but this felt different. It felt like I was being watched. As the sun started setting, I'd camp about a quarter-mile away from the settlement, up on a ridge where I could watch the clearing. I figured whoever lived there would come back eventually, and I wanted to see them before they saw me. Just after dark, I saw the first light down in the clearing. Not electric light, firelight, flickering orange through the cracks in that log building. Smoke started rising from the chimney. They were home. I waited until about 10 o'clock, then worked my way down closer to get a better look. The fog was thick, muffling my footsteps, and I managed to get within about 50 yards of the main building. That's when I saw them. There were at least 6 people moving around the clearing. Men, women, what looked like children. But in the firelight and fog, I couldn't make out details. They moved differently than normal people, though. Smoother, more careful, like they were listening for something with every step. One of them, I think it was a woman, was tending the fire. She was small, hunched over, moving with quick, jerky motions. When she turned toward my direction, I swear I saw light reflecting off her eyes. Not normal human eyes. These glowed like an animal's. I backed away real slow, heart pounding. In 17 years of law enforcement, I'd learned to trust my instincts, and every instinct I had was screaming at me to get the hell out of there. But I'm a professional. I had a job to do. I spent the night on the ridge, watching. They stayed up late, moving around the clearing, doing things I couldn't quite make out. Sometimes I'd hear voices, not talking exactly, but sounds. Clicks and whistles that almost sounded like language. Around 3 a.m, they all disappeared into the buildings. The fire died down to coals, and the clearing went dark again. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, the sun was up and my sleeping bag was soaking wet with dew. I checked my watch, 7:30. Time to make contact. I walked down into the clearing, calling out as I went. "Forest Service? I'd like to talk to whoever's in charge here." The place looked deserted again. No smoke from the chimney, no signs of life. But I knew they were there. I could feel eyes on me from those dark gaps between the logs. I walked up to what looked like the front of the main building. There wasn't really a door, just an opening covered with what looked like animal hides. I cleared my throat and spoke loud enough for anyone inside to hear. "My name's Michael Ridgemont. I'm a ranger with the Forest Service. I got a report about people living up here, and I need to ask you some questions." No response. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I just need to know who you are and how long you've been here. This is federal land, and there are rules about camping and permanent structures." Still nothing. I was about to try again when I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was coming from behind me, but when I turned around, I didn't see anything. It was the sound of breathing. Heavy, deliberate breathing, like someone trying very hard to stay quiet. I turned in a slow circle, hand resting on my service weapon. The clearing was empty, but I knew I wasn't alone. The feeling of being watched was so strong it made my skin crawl. That's when I saw the tracks. They were in the mud around the fire pit, clear as day. Human footprints, but wrong somehow. too wide with toes that were too long, and they were fresh, made since the morning dew. I followed them across the clearing, trying to figure out where they led. They went to the edge of the forest and disappeared into a thicket so dense I couldn't see more than a few feet into it. But I could hear something moving in there, branches breaking, leaves rustling, and that breathing sound, getting fainter as whatever it was moved away from me. I spent another hour searching the clearing, looking for anything that might tell me more about these people. What I found made me more confused than ever. There were bones everywhere. Deer bones, bird bones, what looked like bear bones. But they were arranged in patterns around the buildings. Circles, triangles, lines that seemed to point in specific directions. Some of them were carved with symbols I didn't recognize. In one of the dugouts, I found what looked like a shrine. Animal skulls mounted on wooden posts, surrounded by more bones and what looked like dried plants. In the center was something that made me take a step back. It was a human skull. Old, yellowed with age, but definitely human. And it was wearing what looked like a crown made from deer antlers. I'm not a superstitious man, but standing there in that dark dugout, looking at that skull, I felt something I'd never felt before. Pure, primal fear. The kind of fear our ancestors felt when they heard something big moving through the forest at night. I got out of there fast. By the time I made it back to my campsite on the ridge, I was shaking. Not from cold, from adrenaline. Everything about that place was wrong. The buildings, the tools, the bone arrangements, that skull with the antler crown, and the people. I still hadn't gotten a good look at them, but I knew they were watching me. Every time I turned my back, I could feel eyes on me. When I'd been searching that dugout, I'd heard footsteps outside, circling the building. They were hunting me, playing with me, and I had no idea why. That night, things got worse. I set up my camp in a different spot, higher on the ridge where I could see anyone coming from 3 directions. I built a small fire and settled in to wait for daylight, figuring I'd head back to the station in the morning and call for backup. Around midnight, I heard them coming. It started as just a feeling, that prickle on the back of your neck when you know you're not alone. Then I heard the first sound. A stick breaking, maybe be 100 yards down the slope. Could have been a deer, but deer don't step on sticks when they're trying to be quiet. I put out my fire and grabbed my flashlight and radio. The radio gave me nothing but static. Not unusual in these mountains, but bad timing. I was on my own. The sounds got closer. Not one person moving through the forest, but several. They were spread out, moving in a pattern, like they were surrounding me. I clicked on my flashlight and swept it across the tree line, nothing but fog and shadows. But the sound stopped as soon as the light came on. They knew I was listening. For maybe 10 minutes, everything was quiet. I started to think maybe I'd spooked them off. Then I heard something that made my heart stop. Whistling. Not like a person whistling a tune. This was different. Sharp, piercing notes that seemed to come from 3 directions at once, like they were talking to each other, coordinating. I'd heard that sound before, but it took me a minute to remember where. Wolves. Wolves whistle like that when they're hunting in a pack. But these weren't wolves. These were people. The people who lived in that clearing with the bone shrine and the antler crown. I stood up and called out into the darkness. "I know you're out there. I'm a federal officer. Come out where I can see you." The whistling stopped. For about 30 seconds, the forest was dead quiet. Then I heard footsteps. Lots of them. Moving fast through the underbrush, getting closer. I drew my weapon and clicked the flashlight back on. "Stay back. I'm armed." That's when I saw the first one. It was crouched behind a fallen log about 20 yards away. In the flashlight beam, I could see it was human. Sort of. It had the basic shape of a person, but everything was wrong. The head was too big for the body, the arms were too long, and when it turned to look at me, its eyes reflected the light like an animal's. Not just a little reflection, they glowed like headlights. It was wearing clothes, but they looked like they were made from animal skins. Crude, hand-sewn, patches, fit together with sinew and plant fibers. Its hair was long and matted, hanging down over its face in greasy tangles. But the worst part was its mouth. When it saw my light, it opened its mouth and made that whistling sound. Its teeth were wrong, too sharp, filed to points, and there were too many of them. I'm not ashamed to admit I was scared. In 8 years as a deputy and 17 as a ranger, I'd faced down armed criminals, angry bears, and all kinds of dangerous situations. But I'd never seen anything like this. "Get back!" I shouted, swinging the flashlight beam around. "Stay away from me!" But they were everywhere. I counted at least 5 of them, maybe more, moving through the trees around my campsite. They moved like they could see in the dark, better than I could see with my flashlight. One of them, bigger than the others, probably male, stood up from behind a tree. He was tall, maybe 6.5 feet, but bent over like he wasn't used to standing upright. His face was a nightmare. Scars covered one side like he'd been clawed by a bear. His nose was mostly gone, just holes where it should have been. And his eyes were completely black. No white, no iris. Just black holes in his skull. He opened his mouth and made a sound I'll never forget. Not quite human speech, but not animal either. Like he was trying to talk, but had forgotten how. "Outsider," he said, and his voice sounded like gravel in a cement mixer. "Not welcome here." I kept my gun trained on him, but my hands were shaking so bad I probably couldn't have hit him if I'd tried. "I'm leaving," I managed to say. "First thing in the morning, I'm gone." He tilted his head like he was thinking about that. The others had stopped moving, waiting to see what he'd do. I could hear them breathing in the darkness around me. "Too late," he said finally. "You've seen us. You know." That's when I realized I wasn't going to make it through the night. I don't know if it was training or pure desperation, but something clicked in my mind. I stopped thinking like a scared civilian and started thinking like a cop. These things, whatever they were, had me surrounded. But they were talking instead of attacking. That meant they wanted something. "What do you want?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The big one, their leader, I guess, stepped closer. In the flashlight beam, I could see more details I wished I couldn't. His skin was pale as mushrooms, covered with scars and sores. His fingernails were thick and yellow, grown out like claws. When he breathed, I could hear liquid rattling in his chest. "Been watching you," he said. 2 days, learning your scent, learning your ways." "Why?" He smiled, showing those filed teeth. "Because you found us, and now you belong to us." That's when they attacked. I got one shot off before they rushed me. The bullet took the leader in the shoulder, spinning him around but not dropping him. Then they were on me like a pack of wild animals. But they didn't kill me. They could have. There were too many of them, and they were stronger than they looked. Instead, they wrestled my gun away and held me down while the leader walked over, blood running down his arm from where I'd shot him. "Good," he said, looking at the wound like it was a bug bite. "You fight. We like fighters." He reached into a pouch made from animal skin and pulled out something that looked like dried leaves. Before I could react, he shoved it in my mouth and clamped his hand over my face until I swallowed. The last thing I remember before everything went black was that whistling sound coming from all directions at once, and the feeling that I was falling into a hole that had no bottom. I woke up in hell. At least that's what I thought at first. I was lying on a dirt floor in complete darkness. My head felt like someone had filled it with cotton and broken glass. Every muscle in my body ached, and when I tried to move, I realized my hands were re-tied behind my back with what felt like plant vines. As my eyes adjusted, I started to make out shapes in the darkness. I was in some kind of cave, but not a natural one. The walls were too smooth, too regular. Someone had dug this place out by hand. There were things hanging from the ceiling. At first I thought they were bats, but as my vision cleared, I realized they were much worse. Animal hides, mostly, but some of them looked like they might have come from larger animals, much larger. I tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. Whatever they'd made me swallow had done a number on my system. My stomach felt like it was full of acid, and my vision kept swimming in and out of focus. "Awake now," said a voice from somewhere in the darkness. Female, I thought, but rougher than any woman's voice I'd ever heard. Good. We were getting worried. A figure moved out of the shadows near what looked like the cave entrance. It was one of them, the hill folk, or whatever they were. This one was smaller than the leader, definitely female, but just as wrong-looking as the rest of them. She was old, not just old, ancient. Her skin was like leather that had been left out in the sun for decades. Her hair was white and thin, hanging in wispy strands around her face, but her eyes were bright and intelligent, and when she smiled, I saw that her teeth had been filed to points just like the others. "Who are you people?" I asked, surprised at how weak my voice sounded. She cackled. Actually cackled like a witch in a fairy tale. "People? Is that what you think we are?" She shuffled closer, and I could smell her. It was like rotting leaves mixed with wet dog and something else I couldn't identify. Something dead. "My name is Granny Whitebone," she said, settling down cross-legged in front of me. "I'm the oldest of our family, been living in these mountains for, let me think, 93 years now." That was impossible. She looked old, but not 93 years old. Besides, if she'd been born in 1898, she would have been just a child when her family came to these mountains. "You're lying," I said. She laughed again. "Am I? Time moves different up here, outsider. We live by different rules." She reached out and touched my face with one gnarled finger. Her skin felt like tree bark. "You want to know who we are? What we are?" I nodded, even though I wasn't sure I really wanted to hear the answer. "We came up here during the war, the big war between North and South. My great-grandfather, old Samuel Whitebone, he brought the whole family up to these mountains to get away from the fighting. Figured we'd wait it out, then go back down when it was over." She paused to cough, a wet, rattling sound that went on for almost a minute. "But we never went back down. Something about these mountains, something in the air, in the water. It changed us. First generation, they just lived rough, like pioneers, you know. But their children were different." She pointed to her own face, running a finger along the scars that covered her cheek. "Born different. Saw better in the dark. Heard things other people couldn't hear. Could track a deer for miles just by smell." "That's not possible," I said. But even as I said it, I knew it was true. I'd seen how they moved in the forest, how they'd surrounded me without making a sound. "Each generation got more different," she continued, "more changed. We learned to live like the animals do, hunt in packs, share everything, take care of the family above all else." She leaned closer, and her eyes seemed to glow in the darkness. "We ain't people anymore, outsider. Haven't been for a long time. We're something new, something better." "Better?" I couldn't help but laugh, even though it hurt my throat. "You live in caves. You've never seen a doctor or a dentist in your lives. Your children probably can't even read." Her expression changed, and suddenly I realized I'd made a mistake. The friendly old woman act disappeared, and what I saw underneath was something predatory and dangerous. "Reading," she said, and her voice dropped to a whisper. "What good is reading when you can track a man through the forest by the smell of his fear? What good are doctors when mountain herbs can heal wounds that would kill a normal person? What good are your books when you can speak to the animals themselves?" She stood up, moving with a fluid grace that was definitely not human. "You think you're better than us because you come from down in the valley with your cars and your radios and your guns. But up here, all that means nothing. Up here, we are the top of the food chain." That's when I heard the others coming. Footsteps echoed through the cave system, along with that whistling sound I was beginning to understand was their way of talking to each other. Granny Whitebone smiled her sharp-toothed smile and moved toward the cave entrance. "Family's coming back from the hunt," she said, "and they're hungry." The leader came first, the big scarred one I'd shot the night before. His shoulder was wrapped in what looked like moss and spiderwebs, but he moved like the wound didn't bother him at all. Behind him came the others. Men, women, children. All wrong. All changed. They gathered around me in a circle, and I got my first good look at the whole family. There were maybe 15 of them, ranging from kids who looked about 10 to adults who might have been anywhere from 20 to 60. It was hard to tell. They all had that same weathered, scarred appearance, but they were definitely related. I could see the family resemblance in their bone structure, their eye color, the way they moved. Generations of the same bloodline, isolated in these mountains, changing with each generation into something that wasn't quite human anymore. "This is the one?" asked one of the young airmen, pointing at me. His voice had that same gravelly quality as the leader's. "This is him," Granny Whitebone replied. "The ranger who found our home, shot Cousin Jake here in the shoulder." Jake, the leader, stepped forward and crouched down in front of me. Up close, I could see that his black eyes weren't completely black. There were pupils there, just so dark they blended with the iris. And when he breathed, I could smell his breath. It was like rotting meat mixed with wild onions. "Been a long time since we had a visitor," he said. "Most folks who come up here, well, they don't leave." One of the women laughed. It was a high, cackling sound that echoed off the cave walls. "Remember that hunter last fall? Thought he was so smart with his fancy rifle and his GPS?" "GPS don't work up here," Jake said, never taking his eyes off me. "Radio don't work neither. Nothing from the outside world works in our territory. Mountain protects us." "What do you want from me?" I asked. Jake tilted his head, studying me like I was a bug under a microscope. "Want? We don't want nothing from you, Ranger man. But we got a problem. You seen us. You know where we live. And you're law enforcement." He reached into his pouch and pulled out my badge, along with my gun, radio, and wallet. "Michael Ridgemont, age 41, badge number 447. Been a ranger for 17 years. The fact that he could read surprised me. But then I remembered what Granny Whitebone had said about the children not being able to read. Maybe the older ones, the ones who remembered life before the mountains completely changed them, still had some of their original skills. "You go back down to the valley," Jake continued. "You're going to tell people about us. Maybe bring more rangers up here, maybe scientists, maybe government people who want to study us or move us off our land." "I won't tell anyone," I said. "I swear. I'll say I never found anything." Several of them laughed at that. Jake shook his head. "You will. Maybe not right away, but eventually. It's in your nature. You people down in the valley. You can't leave things alone. Always poking, always investigating, always trying to understand everything." He stood up and looked around at the others. "So, we got two choices. We can kill you, bury your body somewhere it'll never be found. Tell folks you got lost in the mountains and fell in a ravine." My heart started pounding harder. "What's the other choice?" Jake smiled, and it was the most terrifying thing I'd ever seen. "We keep you, make you part of the family, teach you our ways. In a few years, you'll be changed enough that you won't want to go back to the valley anyway." "Changed how?" Granny Whitebone shuffled forward again. In her hand was a clay pot filled with what looked like the same dried leaves they'd forced me to swallow earlier. "Mountain medicine," she said. "Herbs that grow only up here, in the deep places where the old magic still lives. You drink this every day for a month and your body starts to change. Your eyes get better in the dark. Your hearing gets sharper. You start to understand the language of the animals." "And if I refuse?" Jake pulled out a knife made from a sharpened deer bone. "Then you feed the family tonight." I looked around the circle of faces staring down at me. Some looked curious, some looked hungry, but none looked sympathetic. These weren't people anymore. Granny Whitebone had been right about that. They were predators, and I was prey. But I was still alive, which meant they hadn't made their final decision yet. If I agree to stay, what happens to my job? My life down in the valley? People will come looking for me." "That's been handled," Jake said. "Left your truck at the bottom of Devil's Backbone with the keys inside. Rangers go missing in these mountains all the time. Accidents happen." The casual way he said it told me they'd done this before, probably many times. I closed my eyes and tried to think. But the drug they'd given me was making it hard to focus. My thoughts kept sliding around like water on ice. The smart thing would be to agree, go along with whatever they wanted, and look for a chance to escape later. But something told me that once I started drinking their mountain medicine, escape wouldn't be an option anymore. "I need time to think," I said. Jake nodded. "You got until sunset. Then we need an answer." He gestured to two of the younger men, and they hauled me to my feet. My legs were shaky, but I could stand. "Put him in the thinking cave," Jake told them. "Let him consider his options." They dragged me deeper into the cave system, through narrow passages that opened into larger chambers. The walls were covered with paintings, crude but detailed. Hunting scenes, mostly. Animals being chased and killed by human figures. But the human figures in the newer paintings looked more and more like the hill folk themselves, bent over, long-armed, with those glowing eyes. The thinking cave was just a small chamber with a tiny opening that let in some light. They shoved me inside and piled rocks across the entrance, leaving just enough space for air to get through. I was alone with my thoughts, and about 6 hours until sunset, time to figure out how to stay alive. I don't know how long I sat in that cave, but it felt like forever. The drug was wearing off gradually, and my head was getting clearer, clear enough to realize just how much trouble I was in. These people, whatever they'd become, had been living in these mountains for over a century. They'd developed their own culture, their own way of survival, their own rules. And one of their rules was simple. Outsiders either joined the family or died. I thought about my options. I could agree to stay and hope for a chance to escape later. But from what I'd seen, they were too good at tracking, too familiar with this territory. Even if I got away from the cave, I'd never make it 20 miles through the wilderness without them catching me. I could refuse and try to fight. But I was upset. Knee-man with no weapons against 15 people who'd been hunting in these mountains their whole lives. Or I could try something else. Something that might just be crazy enough to work. When they came to get me at sunset, I was ready. Jake was waiting in the main cave with the whole family gathered around him. The children hung back in the shadows, but I could see their glowing eyes watching me. "Made your decision?" Jake asked. "I have," I said. "But first I want to understand something. You said the mountain protects you. What did you mean by that?" Jake exchanged glances with Granny Whitebone. She nodded, like she was giving him permission to answer. "Mountain's alive," Jake said. "Not like an animal, but aware. It chose us, guided us, changed us into what we needed to be to survive up here." "And what does the mountain want in return?" "Respect," Granny Whitebone said. "We take only what we need. We protect the deep places. We keep outsiders from disturbing the old ways." That was what I'd been hoping to hear. "Then you understand that I can't stay," I said. "And you can't kill me." The family stirred uneasily. Jake's hand moved to his bone knife. "Explain," he growled. "I'm a protector too," I said. "For 17 years, I've been keeping people out of places they shouldn't go, stopping them from disturbing things that should be left alone. The mountain didn't bring me here to join you or to die. It brought me here to make a bargain." Jake laughed, but it sounded forced. "What kind of bargain?" "You let me go back to my job, but from now on, I make sure no one else finds you. Devil's Backbone gets declared off-limits, dangerous geological conditions, unstable rock formations, whatever it takes to keep people away." "And why should we trust you?" one of the women asked. I looked around the circle of faces. "Because the mountain chose me too. You said it yourselves. Radios don't work up here. GPS doesn't work. But I found you anyway. I walked straight to your home like I'd been there before. That wasn't luck." Granny Whitebone was studying me with those bright, intelligent eyes. "You felt it too, didn't you? The pull, like something was guiding your steps." I had felt it, though I'd written it off as good woodcraft and luck. But looking back, there had been moments when I'd known which way to go without really knowing why. "The mountain brought us together for a reason," I said. "Not so you could add me to your family, and not so you could kill me. So we could help each other. You protect the deep places, and I protect you from the outside world." Jake was quiet for a long time, The whole family waited, watching him think. Finally, he nodded. "One chance," he said. "You keep your word. We keep ours. But if outsiders come here again, if anyone disturbs our territory—" "They won't," I said. "I promise." Granny Whitebone shuffled forward with that clay pot again. "Drink," she said. "Just a little. So the mountain knows you're bound to your word." I took the pot and looked into it. The liquid inside was dark and thick, with things floating in it I didn't want to identify. "What will it do to me?" "Mark you," she said. "So we can find you if we need to. So you can find us. But not change you. Not unless you drink much more." I lifted the pot to my lips and swallowed a single mouthful. It tasted like dirt and rotting leaves and something else I couldn't identify. Almost immediately, I felt a burning sensation in my chest, like swallowing hot coals. "Now you're part of the mountain." My name is David Colborn, and I've been a forest ranger for 20 years. Most folks around eastern Kentucky know me as the guy who makes dangerous places safe for hikers. I've sealed mine shafts, marked unstable cliffs, and cleared fallen trees from trails more times than I can count. My daddy was a coal miner, and his daddy before him. But I chose a different path, protecting the mountains instead of digging into them. November 1976 was colder than usual. The fog hung thick in the hollers every morning, and ice covered the streams before sunrise. I was working the Pine Mountain Ridge section of Daniel Boone National Forest, checking on some old railroad infrastructure that hikers had been asking about. The abandoned LN Railroad Tunnel cut straight through Pine Mountain, 1,200 feet of darkness boring through solid rock. They built it back in 1910, but sealed it up after too many accidents. The old-timers still told stories about Engine 97, the passenger train that wrecked in there during a November storm in 1911. 23 people died that night. The company sealed both ends of the tunnel with concrete and steel after that, but 65 years later, the seals were starting to crack. That's where the problem started. 3 different hiking groups had reported strange sounds coming from inside the sealed tunnel. Train whistles, they said, even the sound of screaming. One group swore they saw lights moving around inside through the cracks in the concrete. I didn't believe any of it. 45 years old, and I'd never seen anything I couldn't explain with common sense. Old tunnels make weird sounds when wind blows through them. Lights could be anything. Reflected sunlight, car headlights from the highway 8 miles away, even foxfire from rotting wood. But people were getting spooked, and spooked people do stupid things, like trying to break into sealed tunnels. My job was to inspect the seals, make sure they were solid, and maybe add some extra concrete if needed. The morning I hiked up to the tunnel, the fog was so thick I could barely see 10 feet ahead. My boots crunched through frost-covered leaves as I climbed the old railroad grade. Strip mining had torn up most of the mountainside, leaving behind piles of broken rock and dead trees. The tunnel entrance sat in a clearing surrounded by that devastation, like a mouth in a skull. Both ends of the tunnel were sealed tight with concrete barriers about 6 feet high. Steel mesh covered the gaps at the top where the tunnel's arched ceiling met the barriers. Everything looked solid from the outside. But when I got closer to the north entrance, I noticed something that made me stop and stare. There was a railroad spike driven into the solid rock wall next to the concrete seal. Not an old rusted spike. This one looked new. And when I touched it, the metal was warm despite the freezing morning air. I pulled out my notebook and wrote down everything I saw. Fresh metal spike, warm to touch. No obvious way anyone could have driven it into solid rock without heavy equipment. The logical explanation was that someone was playing pranks, trying to scare hikers. Maybe the same person who had been making the sounds people reported. But as I stood there in the fog, writing in my notebook, I heard something that made my pen stop moving. A low whistle, like steam escaping from a kettle. It was coming from inside the sealed tunnel. I walked around to the south entrance. Same concrete barrier, same steel mesh at the top. But here, I could hear the sound more clearly. Not just a whistle. Voices. Faint, like people talking in the distance. And underneath it all, a rhythmic sound like metal wheels rolling over railroad tracks. I pressed my ear against the cold concrete. The sounds were definitely Ming from inside the tunnel. But that was impossible. The tunnel had been sealed for decades. Even if someone had broken in somehow, there were no railroad tracks left inside. The company had pulled them all up in 1923. My radio crackled. "David, this is Base. How's that tunnel inspection going?" I keyed the mic. "Still checking things out, Martha. The seals look solid from the outside. Might take a while to do a full inspection." "Copy that. Weather Service says fog's going to get thicker this afternoon. Be careful up there." I clicked off and looked at the tunnel entrance again. Whatever was making those sounds, I needed to figure it out. People's safety depended on it. If someone was messing around inside a sealed tunnel, they could get hurt. Or worse. I had rope, flashlights, and basic climbing gear in my pack. The steel mesh at the top of the barrier had a gap just wide enough for a man to squeeze through if he really wanted to. It would be dangerous, and probably against regulations. But if someone was trapped inside, I needed to help them. The warm railroad spike bothered me more than I wanted to admit. Who would go to the trouble of driving a spike into solid rock? And how? The more I thought about it, the less sense it made. But I was a forest ranger. My job was to solve problems and keep people safe. Ghost stories weren't going to stop me from doing that job. I shouldered my pack and started looking for a way to climb up to that gap in the mesh. Getting through the barrier was harder than I expected. The concrete was slippery with frost, and the steel mesh had sharp edges that grabbed at my jacket. But I managed to squeeze through the gap and drop down into the tunnel entrance. The smell hit me first. Coal smoke and machine oil, like standing in a train yard. That didn't make sense. This tunnel had been sealed for decades. There shouldn't be any smell except maybe damp rock and bat droppings. I turned on my flashlight and swept the beam into the darkness ahead. The tunnel stretched out straight as an arrow, disappearing into black, water drippy, head from somewhere in the distance. My footsteps echoed off the curved walls as I moved deeper inside. 20 feet in, I found the first thing that made my skin crawl. A piece of luggage sitting against the tunnel wall. Old-fashioned leather suitcase with brass corners, the kind people used in the 1910s. The leather was cracked and stained, but not rotted like it should have been after 65 years in a damp tunnel. I knelt down and opened it up. Inside were clothes, a man's wool coat, white shirts with detachable collars, suspenders. At the bottom was a train ticket, Chicago Eastern Illinois Railroad, dated November 15, 1911. The passenger's name was printed clearly, Mr. James Whitfield, Car 3, Seat 12, November 15, 1911. The same date as the Engine 97 disaster. My hands were shaking as I closed the suitcase. This had to be some kind of historical recreation. Maybe the State Parks Department was setting up a memorial display and hadn't told me about it. But why put it inside a sealed tunnel? I stood up and kept walking deeper into the tunnel, my flashlight beam dancing ahead of me. The smell of coal smoke was getting stronger. And now I could hear something else. A rhythmic clicking sound. Like metal tapping against metal. 50 feet from the entrance, my light found railroad tracks. That stopped me cold. I knew for a fact that the LN had pulled up all the tracks in 1923. I had the historical records in my office. But here they were, 2 parallel lines of steel rails, complete with wooden ties and gravel ballast. They looked old, but not abandoned. Someone had been maintaining them. The clicking sound was coming from the rails themselves. I knelt down and touched one of the steel rails with my glove. It was warm, and I could feel a faint vibration, like something heavy was moving on the tracks somewhere in the distance. My radio crackled with static, then went silent. I tried to call Martha back at base, but all I got was white noise. The mountains played hell with radio signals, but I'd never had trouble this close to the entrance before. That's when I heard the whistle again. Louder this time, echoing off the tunnel walls. It sounded like a steam locomotive, the kind of long, mournful blast they used to signal their approach to a station. But it was coming from deep inside the tunnel, from the direction where I knew the 1911 wreck had happened. I should have left right then. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get out of that tunnel and never come back. But I kept thinking about those hikers who might be in danger. If someone was playing games with fake trains and historical displays, they could get hurt. And if someone was actually trapped deeper in the tunnel, I was their only hope. I started walking toward the sound, following the railroad tracks. My flashlight beam reached about 30 feet ahead, creating a small circle of light in an ocean of darkness. The tunnel walls were solid rock, carved smooth by the workers who had blasted through the mountain 70 years ago. Water dripped steadily from cracks in the ceiling, forming small pools between the railroad ties. 100 feet in, I found another suitcase, then another. Luggage scattered along the tracks like someone had thrown it from a moving train. Each piece was from the same era. Leather bags with brass fittings, hat boxes, even a small trunk with someone's initials carved into the lid. I opened a few of them. All contained clothes and personal items from 1911. All had train tickets with the same date, November 15, 1911. All were passengers on Engine 97. The whistle sounded again, much closer now. Close enough that I could hear the difference between the engine whistle and something else, a steam release valve, the kind they used to let pressure out of the boiler. My grandfather had worked on steam engines, and he'd taught me the sounds they made. But there were no steam engines left in eastern Kentucky. The last one had been scrapped in 1950s. I was about 200 feet into the tunnel when I saw the light. It started as just a faint glow in the distance, like someone was carrying a lantern far ahead of me. But as I watched, it got brighter and brighter, and I realized it wasn't a lantern at all. It was a train headlight, a real locomotive headlight, cutting through the darkness of the tunnel like a sword. I could hear the engine now, the chuff, chuff, chuff of a steam engine under power, the squeal of metal wheels on railroad tracks, the hiss of steam and the clang of the bell. Engine 97 was coming straight at me. I pressed myself against the tunnel wall, my heart hammering in my chest. This was impossible. There was no train. There hadn't been a train in this tunnel for 65 years. But I could feel the vibration in the rock now, feel the rush of displaced air as the locomotive approached. The headlight got brighter and brighter until it filled the entire tunnel with white light. I could see the engine clearly now, a massive black steam locomotive with a cowcatcher on the front and a tall smokestack belching white steam. Behind it were 3 passenger cars, their windows glowing with warm yellow light. The train was going to hit me. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. I closed my eyes and waited for the impact. The locomotive passed right through me. I felt a moment of impossible cold, like diving into a frozen lake. Then the train was past, and I could see the passenger cars rolling by. Through the windows, I saw people in 1911 clothing, men in suits and bowler hats, women in long dresses and elaborate hats. They were talking and laughing, completely unaware that their train was about to crash. The last car disappeared into the darkness toward the tunnel entrance. I stood there shaking, trying to understand what I had just seen, trying to convince myself it hadn't happened. But the L of coal smoke lingered in the air. And on the railroad tracks, I could see fresh wheel marks in the rust. I turned and ran toward the tunnel entrance, stumbling over railroad ties, my bitchy flashlight beam bouncing wildly. Behind me, I heard the screech of brakes and the grinding crash of metal on stone, then screaming. Lots of screaming. Engine 97 had just wrecked again, and somehow I knew it was going to keep happening until someone figured out how to stop it. I made it back to the ranger station before dark, but I couldn't stop shaking. Martha took one look at me and put on a pot of coffee. "You look like you've seen a ghost, David." If she only knew. I sat in my office for 2 hours staring at a blank incident report. How do you write up seeing a phantom train? How do you explain railroad tracks that shouldn't exist and luggage from dead passengers? The state would think I'd lost my mind. Instead, I called Frank Whistle down at the Kentucky Railroad Museum. Frank knew more about local railroad history than anyone alive. If there was a logical explanation for what I'd seen, he would know it. "Frank, it's David Colborne up at Daniel Boone. I need to ask you about Engine 97. "The Pine Mountain wreck? That's a sad story, David. What do you need to know?" Tell me exactly what happened that night. Frank's voice got serious. November 15th, 1911. Worst storm in 50 years. Engine 97 was running 4 hours late from Louisville, trying to make up time. Engineer was a young fellow named Tom Bradley. Good man, but maybe too eager to please. They hit the tunnel at full speed, probably 40 miles per hour, way too fast for that curve inside the mountain. What curve? About halfway through the tunnel, there's a sharp curve to the left. The original surveyors had to follow a vein of softer rock. Most engineers knew to slow down for it, but Bradley was new to the route. Train derailed on that curve and slammed into the tunnel wall. Engine, tender, and all 3 passenger cars. 23 people killed, including Bradley and his fireman. I wrote down everything Frank told me. The curve was about 600 feet from the north entrance, exactly where I'd heard the crash happen. Frank, one more question. Did they ever remove the wreckage? That's the strange part. The tunnel was so damaged that they couldn't get heavy equipment inside to clear it out. Company just sealed both ends and wrote it off as a total loss. Far as I know, Engine 97 is still in there. After I hung up, I sat staring at my notes. If the wreckage was still inside the tunnel, that might explain some of what I'd seen. Old metal, standing water, and underground air currents could create all kinds of strange effects. Maybe the phantom train was just my mind playing tricks on me. But that didn't explain the luggage, or the railroad tracks, or the warm railroad spike driven into solid rock. I needed to go back. This time I brought better equipment. Backup flashlights, a camera, sample bags for any evidence I found. And I brought my .38 service revolver. I knew bullets wouldn't stop a ghost train, but having the gun made me feel better. I reached the tunnel just before dawn. The fog was thicker than the day before, turning the world into a gray soup. I could barely see the tunnel entrance until I was standing right in front of it. The concrete barrier looked different. There were fresh scratches in the concrete around the base, like something with metal wheels had been scraping against it. And the warm railroad spike was gone. In its place was a train ticket, folded and stuck into a crack in the rock. I unfolded the ticket with shaking hands. Mrs. Sarah Mackenzie, Car 2, Seat 8, November 15th, 1911. A woman's voice spoke behind me. That's my ticket. I spun around, gun drawn. A woman in a long dark coat was standing in the fog about 10 feet away. She looked to be in her 30s with her hair pinned up in the style of the 1910s. Her face was pale, and her eyes were the saddest things I'd ever seen. Please, she said, you have to help us. Who are you? My voice came out as a whisper. Sarah Mackenzie. I was traveling to see my sister in Cincinnati. The train crashed, didn't it? I lowered my gun but kept it ready. This woman looked solid enough, but something about her made my skin crawl. Her breath didn't make any vapor in the cold air. Ma'am, that crash happened 65 years ago. In 1911. She looked confused. No, that's not right. It was just last night. Tom was driving too fast and we hit that curve. Oh God, we hit that curve. She started crying, tears streaming down her pale cheeks. Listen to me, I said. You need to come with me. We'll get you to a hospital, get you checked out. But when I reached out to take her arm, my hand passed right through her. She was as solid as smoke. You're dead, I said. It came out flat and matter of fact, like I was commenting on the weather. She nodded. I know, but we can't leave. Something's wrong. The train keeps trying to run, but it can't get past the crash. We're stuck here, going around and around trying to get to Cincinnati. We? That's when I heard them. Voices in the fog, getting closer. Men, women, and children, all talking at once. They appeared out of the gray mist like something from a nightmare. 23 people in 1911 clothing, all looking lost and scared. A young man in a conductor's uniform stepped forward. Are you here to help us, sir? We've been waiting so long for someone to help us. I wanted to run. Every rational part of my brain was screaming at me to get out of there. But these people, these ghosts, looked so hopeful. They'd been trapped in this tunnel for 65 years, reliving their deaths over and over again. What do you need me to do? I heard myself ask. The conductor smiled. The train has to complete its run. If we can just get to Cincinnati, we can rest. But something's blocking the tracks. The wreckage, I said. Your train is still in there. Then you have to move it. You have to clear the way so we can finish our journey. Behind them, I heard the familiar sound of a steam whistle. Engine 97 was coming again, ready for another run through the tunnel. Ready for another crash. The ghosts started walking toward the tunnel entrance, passing through the concrete barrier like it wasn't there. Sarah Mackenzie was the last one to go. She turned back to look at me. "Please hurry," she said. "Every time we crash, it hurts just as much as the first time." Then she was gone, and I was alone with the fog and the sound of an approaching train. I climbed through the gap in the barrier and dropped into the tunnel. This time, I knew what to expect. The luggage scattered along the tracks, the smell of coal smoke, the impossible railroad that shouldn't exist. But I also knew something else now. Those 23 people had been trapped here for 65 years, dying over and over again every time someone heard the train. They needed someone to help them find peace. The question was, how do you clear a train wreck that exists only in the spirit world? Engine 97's headlight appeared in the distance, growing brighter as it approached the curve where it would derail. I pressed myself against the tunnel wall and waited for the phantom train to pass through me again. This time, I was going to follow it to the crash site. The phantom train roared past me again, all steam and steel and impossible noise. But this time, instead of running away from the crash, I ran after it. My flashlight beam bounced wildly as I stumbled over railroad ties, following the sound of the locomotive deeper into the tunnel. I reached the curve just as Engine 97 hit it. The derailment was exactly like Frank had described. The locomotive's wheels couldn't hold the track at that speed, and the entire train slid sideways into the tunnel wall with a grinding crash that shook the mountain. Steam filled, too. The tunnel as the boiler ruptured. In the passenger cars, people screamed and cried for help. But here's the thing that made my blood freeze. I could see the real wreckage, too. Engine 97 was still there, exactly where it had crashed 65 years ago. The locomotive was a twisted mass of black metal, its cowcatcher buried in the tunnel wall. The tender had jackknifed sideways, spilling coal across the tracks. All 3 passenger cars were derailed and crumpled like tin cans. But overlaying the rusted wreckage was the ghost train, still trying to complete its run. The phantom locomotive was fighting to get free, its drive wheels spinning uselessly as it pushed against the real wreckage blocking the tunnel. The ghosts of the passengers were climbing out of the spectral cars, looking around in confusion. They could see me clearly now, the living man who had followed them into death. "You came," Sarah Mackenzie said, relief clear in her voice. "You actually came." Tom Bradley, the young engineer, approached me. Half his head was crushed from the crash, but he spoke clearly. "Sir, I need to get this train to Cincinnati. My passengers are counting on me, but something's wrong with the track ahead." I looked at the twisted metal of the real wreckage, then at the phantom train that was trying to push through it. "Tom, you crashed. All of you died in 1911. This is your engine, and these are your passenger cars." He looked confused. "That can't be right. I'm a good engineer. I would never crash my train." "You were going too fast for the curve. It was an accident." The other ghosts were gathering around us now, all 23 victims of the wreck. In the spectral light from the phantom train, I could see their injuries, the cuts, the broken bones, the crushed skulls. But they didn't seem to understand what had happened to them. "We need to get to Cincinnati," a woman in a feathered hat insisted. "I have to meet my husband at Union Station." "My sister's wedding is tomorrow," Sarah added. "I can't be late." They had been trapped in the moment of their deaths for 65 years, unable to accept what had happened. The phantom train kept trying to complete its run because they couldn't let go of their final destination. That's when I understood what I had to do. "You're right," I told them. "You do need to complete your journey, but not to Cincinnati." I pulled out my flashlight and aimed the beam at the real wreckage. "This is Engine 97. This is your train. You crashed here on November 15th, 1911, trying to get to Cincinnati. But your real destination isn't a city. It's rest." Tom Bradley stared at the twisted locomotive. For the first time, recognition dawned in his eyes. Oh God, I killed them all. No, I said firmly. You tried your best. The storm made you late, and you were trying to make up time. It was an accident. The Phantom train's whistle blew one last time, not the urgent blast of an approaching locomotive, but a long, sad farewell. The spectral engine began to fade, its headlight growing dimmer. What's happening? Sarah asked, fear in her voice. You're letting go, I said. You're finally able to leave. But even as the words left my mouth, I realized something was wrong. The tunnel was getting colder, much colder. Ice was forming on the walls, and my breath came out in white puffs. The Phantom train wasn't fading, it was getting stronger. The headlight blazed brighter than ever, and I could feel the heat from its firebox on my face. No, Tom Bradley said, his voice changing, becoming deeper and more hollow. We've been here too long. We can't leave now, but you can stay with us. The other ghosts were changing too. Their faces were becoming twisted with rage and madness. 65 years of being trapped had driven them insane. You can help us, Sarah said, but her voice was no longer sad. It was hungry. If we have someone alive with us, maybe we can finally get out of this tunnel. The Phantom locomotive star, Ted moving toward me, its cowcatcher aimed at my chest. Behind it, the ghost passengers were climbing back aboard, all of them staring at me with hollow, desperate eyes. They didn't want to find peace. They wanted to drag me back to 1911 with them. I raised my gun, knowing it was useless against the dead. The train was 10 feet away and closing fast, 5 feet, 3 feet. Wait, I shouted. You're not murderers. You're just people who wanted to get home. The locomotive stopped just inches from my chest. Tom Bradley leaned out of the cab, his ruined face inches from mine. What did you say? You're not killers, I repeated. You're good people who died in a terrible accident. Sarah was going to her sister's wedding. Tom, you were just trying to do your job. Don't let this place turn you into something evil. For a moment, the madness cleared from their eyes. They remembered who they had been in life. Ordinary people with families and dreams and hopes for the future. We've been here so long, Sarah whispered. We forgot who we were. I know, I said. But you can remember now. You can choose to let go. Tom Bradley looked back at his Phantom engine, then at the real wreckage that had trapped them for 65 years. I was a good engineer, he said quietly. I never wanted to hurt anyone. Then don't hurt me, I said. Help your passengers find peace instead. The Phantom train began to fade again, this time for real. The ghosts of the 23 passengers started glowing with a soft, warm light that had nothing to do with train headlights or spectral fire. Thank you, Sarah said as she became transparent. Thank you for reminding us who we were. One by one, they faded away. Tom Bradley was the last to go. Tell them we're sorry, he said. Tell them Engine 97 won't be late anymore. Then he was gone, and I was alone in the tunnel with nothing but the rusted wreckage of a train that had crashed before my father was born. The temperature returned to normal. The Phantom railroad tracks disappeared, leaving only broken stone and pools of stagnant water. My radio crackled back to life. David, this is Martha. Are you okay up there? Lost your signal for a while. I keyed the mic with a shaking hand. I'm fine, Martha. Inspection's complete. We need to seal this tunnel permanently. Copy that. Anything interesting to report? I looked at the twisted metal of Engine 97, finally at rest after 65 years of Phantom runs. Just some old railroad equipment. Nothing that can hurt anyone anymore. It took 3 weeks to get the paperwork approved, but we finally sealed the Pine Mountain Tunnel for good. I supervised the work myself, making sure the concrete barriers were twice as thick as the old ones. No more gaps in the mesh. No way for curious hikers to get inside. But before we closed it up forever, I did something that wasn't in any manual or regulation. I had a bronze plaque made and mounted it on the concrete barrier. In memory of the 23 passengers and crew of Engine 97 who died in this tunnel on November 15, 1911. They were good people trying to get home. Frank Whistle came up for the dedication ceremony. He brought flowers, 23 roses, one for each victim. We left them at the base of the plaque. "You know," Frank said as we stood there in the November cold, "I always wondered why Engine 97 was running so late that night. Turns out the engineer, Tom Bradley, had stopped the train outside Louisville to help a family whose car had broken down in the storm. Made them an hour later, but he probably saved those folks' lives." I nodded. Tom Bradley had been a good man trying to do his job. All of them had been good people who deserved to be remembered for who they were in life, not trapped forever by how they died. The hikers stopped reporting strange sounds after we sealed the tunnel. No more train whistles, no more lights in the darkness. The phantom passengers had finally completed their journey. But my job as a forest ranger had changed. I started researching other transportation disasters in eastern Kentucky, mine cave-ins where the dead were never recovered, bridge collapses where the wreckage was left in place, airplane crashes in remote mountains where the victims were buried where they fell. I wasn't the only ranger dealing with these situations. Martha started getting calls from other stations about similar incidents. Phantom mine cars in abandoned coal shafts, ghost buses on mountain roads where fatal accidents had occurred, the spirits of the dead, trapped by sudden, violent deaths and unable to find peace. We started a new protocol, unofficial, never written down in any manual. When rangers encountered supernatural activity at disaster sites, we didn't try to debunk it or explain it away. We listened to the dead, helped them remember who they had been in life, and gave them permission to let go. Most importantly, we made sure they were remembered. Plaques, monuments, memorial gardens, anything to ensure that good people who died in bad places weren't forgotten by the living. Because that's what they really wanted in the end. Not revenge, not to drag the living into death with them. They just wanted someone to remember that they had lived, that they had mattered, that their deaths meant something. 3 months after we sealed the Pine Mountain Tunnel, I got a letter addressed to the Daniel Boone National Forest. No return address, postmarked from Cincinnati, Ohio. Inside was a single photograph, 23 people standing in front of Union Station, all of them smiling and waving at the camera. Men in suits and bowler hats, women in long dresses and elaborate hats. At the bottom, someone had written in faded ink, "Thank you for helping us get home." I recognized them all. The passengers and crew of Engine 97, finally at their destination. I keep that photograph in my desk drawer, along with the railroad spike that appeared warm to my touch that first morning at the tunnel. Sometimes late at night when I'm finishing paperwork, I take them out and look at them. They remind me that death isn't always the end of the story. Sometimes the dead need help from the living to write the final chapter. And sometimes, if you're brave enough to listen, they'll tell you how that chapter should end. The mountains of eastern Kentucky are full of places where good people died suddenly and violently. Mine shafts, railroad tunnels, collapsed bridges, crashed airplanes. Most of them are just empty places now, marked by historical signs and memorial plaques. But some of them still echo with the voices of the dead, calling out for someone to remember their names, their faces, their stories, for someone to help them find the peace that sudden death stole from them. That's my job now. Not just keeping the mountains safe for the living, but helping the dead find their way home. Because everyone deserves to complete their journey, even if it takes 65 years and the help of a stranger to do it. And if you're ever hiking through the Daniel Boone National Forest and you come across a memorial plaque in an unexpected place, stop and read it. Remember the names. Remember that they were real people with real lives and real dreams. Remember that they mattered. The dead are counting on you to remember. My name is Thomas Kettlewell, and I've been rescuing people from caves for 14 years. In all that time, pulling folks out of dark holes in the ground, I never believed the old mountain stories about things living deep underground. Should have listened better. It was late October 1963 when the call came in. 3 experienced cavers, the Morrison brothers and their friend Pete, had been missing for 2 days in the cave system beneath Dark Hollow Falls. That was unusual. These weren't weekend warriors who got lost looking for adventure. The Morrisons had been exploring caves since they were kids, knew every tunnel and chamber in Shenandoah better than most rangers knew the hiking trails. I grabbed my gear and headed out with my partner, Jim Hawkins. The drive up to Dark Hollow took us through thick morning fog that clung to the mountains like wet cotton. You could barely see 10 feet in front of the truck. "Weather's been strange all week," Jim said, staring out at the white wall surrounding us. "Old-timers in town say the fog only gets this thick when something's stirring underground." I laughed. "Come on, Jim. You sound like my grandmother talking about spirits in the wells." But even as I said it, something felt wrong. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no insects, nothing. Just our truck engine and the crunch of gravel under the tires. We parked at the trailhead and hiked the last mile to the cave entrance. Dark Hollow got its name honest. Even on sunny days, the ravine stayed shadowed and cold. Today, with the fog, it felt like walking into a grave. The cave mouth yawned open in the limestone cliff like a giant's mouth. Water from the falls above trickled down and disappeared into the darkness. I'd been in this cave dozens of times for rescues and surveys. It dropped straight down about 400 feet through a series of chambers and tunnels. Some places, you had to rope down vertical shafts. Other spots opened into rooms big as churches. "Their car's still here," Jim pointed to a beat-up Ford pickup parked near the trail. "They planned to be out yesterday morning." I checked my equipment one more time. Rope, headlamp, emergency radio, medical kit, spare batteries. Everything looked good. Jim did the same. We'd done this dance so many times we could set up in the dark. "Radio check," I called to base camp. Static crackled back. "Base to Rescue 1. We hear you, Thomas. Heading underground. 2 missing. Correction. 3 missing cavers. We'll check in every 30 minutes. Copy that. Good hunting." I clipped the radio to my belt and adjusted my headlamp. The beam cut through the fog and lit up the cave entrance. Water droplets sparkled like tiny stars on the rock walls. "You ever notice how quiet it gets around this place?" Jim asked as we approached the entrance. I had noticed. Even the sound of the waterfall seemed muffled, like someone had thrown a blanket over the whole ravine. "Probably just the fog," I said, but my voice sounded strange even to me. We crossed the threshold into darkness. Our lights pushed back the black, showing the familiar limestone walls streaked with minerals. The air smelled damp and earthy, with a hint of something else I couldn't identify. Something old. The first chamber dropped away beneath us, our lights barely reaching the bottom. I secured my rope to the anchor point we'd installed years ago and tested the knot twice. Standard procedure. "After you," Jim said. I swung over the edge and started down. The rope felt solid, my gear worked perfectly. Just another rescue. But as I descended into the earth, leaving the last trace of daylight behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the deeper darkness below. The cave had always been cold, but today it felt different, colder, like the rock itself was holding its breath. At the bottom of the first drop, I waited for Jim to join me. Our lights danced across the walls, casting weird shadows that seemed to move on their own. "Morrison! Pete!" I called out. "Can you hear us?" My voice echoed back from multiple directions, bouncing off rock walls and disappearing down tunnels. But there was something wrong with the echo. It sounded longer than it should have, like the cave was bigger than I remembered. "We're here to help," Jim added. Again, that strange echo. And for just a second, I could have sworn I heard something else mixed in with our voices. Something that sounded almost like whispers. "Did you hear that?" I asked. "Hear what?" Maybe I was imagining things. Caves played tricks on your hearing all the time. I'd been doing this long enough to know better than to jump at shadows. We moved deeper, following the main passage toward the second chamber. This part of the cave was familiar territory, a tunnel about 6 feet wide that sloped gradually downward. Our lights showed fresh scuff marks on the walls where the missing cavers had passed through. But then I saw something that made me stop. "Jim, look at this." Scratched into the limestone wall about chest high were strange symbols. They looked old, but the rock dust around them was fresh. Someone had carved these recently. Cherokee, maybe? Jim suggested. The old-timers say this was a sacred place before the park was established. The symbols were rough and angular, like someone had carved them in a hurry, or in the dark. They seemed to spiral around each other, forming patterns that hurt to look at too long. The Morrison brothers wouldn't have done this, I said. They respect caves too much to carve up the walls. Then who did? I didn't have an answer. But as we stood there studying the symbols, I heard it again, that whisper sound hiding in our echoes. This time, it was clearer. It sounded like voices calling for help. Did you hear that? I grabbed Jim's arm. We stood perfectly still, listening. Gee. The cave was silent except for the distant drip of water somewhere in the darkness ahead. Morrison, I called again. If you can hear us, make noise. Bang on something. The echo came back normal this time, but then, from somewhere deeper in the cave system, we heard it clearly. Help us! We're trapped! Jim and I looked at each other. The voice was definitely one of the Morrison brothers, but it seemed to come from 3 different directions at once. That's impossible, Jim muttered. Sound doesn't work that way down here. I'd been in enough caves to know he was right. The acoustics in limestone caves followed rules. Sound bounced off walls in predictable patterns. But this voice seemed to come from the solid rock itself. We need to move faster, I said. We pushed deeper into the cave, following the main passage toward the second chamber. The symbols on the walls continued, carved into the rock every 20 or 30 feet. Some were simple scratches. Others looked almost like letters in a language I didn't recognize. Our headlamps started acting strange. The beams flickered and dimmed without warning, even though I'd put fresh batteries in before we started. Jim tapped his light and the beam strengthened, then faded again. Electrical interference, he suggested. From what? We're 400 feet underground. The second chamber opened ahead of us, a room about the size of a basketball court with 3 tunnels leading deeper into the mountain. This was where things got complicated. The cave split into multiple branches here, some dropping straight down through vertical shafts, others winding through narrow passages that could dead-end or loop back on themselves. In the center of the chamber, our lights picked up something that made my stomach clench. Equipment, ropes, helmets, a backpack, all arranged in a perfect circle on the cave floor. What the hell? Jim breathed. We moved closer. It was definitely the missing caver's gear, but it had been arranged with careful precision. The ropes formed a spiral pattern with the helmets placed at specific points around the circle. In the center sat an old-fashioned lantern I'd never seen before. They wouldn't have done this, I said. No caver leaves their gear behind, especially not arranged like some kind of ritual. Jim picked up one of the helmets. This is Dave Morrison's. See the scratch on the front where he hit that low ceiling last spring? I knelt beside the lantern in the center. It was old, made of tarnished brass and thick glass. The wick was burned down low, but still glowing with a weak flame that shouldn't have been possible. There was no airflow down here to keep it burning. Thomas, Jim's voice was tight. Look at the walls. I raised my light. The symbols we'd been seeing were carved all around this chamber, covering every surface. But these were different, deeper, older looking, and they seemed to spiral inward toward the center of the room where we stood. Help us! The voice came again, louder this time. But now I could tell it was coming from the tunnel to our right, the one that led to the deepest part of the cave system. We're coming, I called back. But as soon as I spoke, the voice answered from the left tunnel. Hurry, the water's rising. Then from the tunnel behind us, we can't get out. 3 voices, 3 directions, all of them sounding exactly like Dave Morrison. That's not possible, Jim said. He was backing toward the entrance tunnel, his light sweeping nervously across the walls. I tried the radio. Base, this is Rescue 1. Do you copy? Static. Then a voice that might have been our dispatcher, but sounded strange. We copy, Rescue 1. Any sign of the missing cavers? We found their equipment, but something's wrong down here. The cave acoustics are... The radio went dead. No static, no background noise, just silence. Thomas. Jim's voice was barely a whisper. The lantern's getting brighter. He was right. The flame in the old lantern was growing, casting dancing shadows on the carved walls. The symbols seemed to move in the flickering light. We need to get out of here, Jim said. But before I could answer, we heard footsteps coming from the right tunnel. Slow, deliberate steps echoing off the stone walls. Thank God, I said. Dave, is that you? The footsteps stopped. Dave Morrison, can you hear me? A voice answered from the tunnel. Dave's voice, but wrong somehow. The words came too slowly, like someone learning to speak for the first time. Thomas, Kettlewell, we have been waiting for you. The hair on my neck stood up. I'd known Dave Morrison for 5 years. He was a fast talker, always cracking jokes. This slow, careful speech wasn't him. Dave, are you hurt? Where are your brothers? They are with me, down in the deep places. Jim grabbed my shoulder. We need to leave, now. But I was a rescue ranger. I'd never left anyone in a cave, no matter how strange things got. Dave, I'm coming to get you. Stay where you are and keep talking so I can find you. I started toward the right tunnel, but Jim held me back. Look at your rope, he hissed. I looked down. The climbing rope clipped to my belt was moving. Not swaying in some air current. There was no air current. It was writhing like a snake, the coils shifting and changing shape on their own. The cave's doing this, I whispered. The cave itself is... Before I could finish the thought, all 3 tunnels echoed with Dave Morrison's voice at the same time. Come deeper, Thomas. Come see what we've found. The lantern flame leaped higher, and in its light I saw something that made my blood turn to ice water. The symbols carved into the walls weren't random. They formed words. Old words in a language that might have been Cherokee, but older. And as the light grew brighter, I could read them. They were names. Hundreds of names carved into the stone. And at the bottom, in fresh scratches that gleamed white against the dark limestone, were 3 new ones. David Morrison, Frank Morrison, Peter Kowalski. Run! The word came out of my mouth before I'd even decided to speak. Jim didn't need to be told twice. We grabbed our gear and headed for the entrance tunnel as fast as we could move. Behind us, that voice that might have been Dave Morrison called out, "Don't leave us, Thomas. The deep ones are so lonely." We climbed the rope out of the second chamber like our lives depended on it. Maybe they did. At the top, I looked back and saw something that made my hands shake on the rope. The lantern wasn't just getting brighter. It was floating, rising slowly toward the ceiling of the chamber below us, casting wild shadows that looked almost like reaching hands. "Keep moving," Jim shouted. We made it to the first chamber and started up the main rope toward the cave entrance. But as we climbed, I heard something that stopped me cold. Singing. Old voices, many of them, singing in that same ancient language from the wall carvings. The melody was sad and strange, like a lullaby sung at a funeral. And mixed in with the old voices, I could hear newer ones. Dave Morrison, his brother Frank, Pete Kowalski, all singing together. "Jim, do you hear?" I turned around and Jim wasn't behind me anymore. "Jim," I called, "I'm here." His voice came from below, back in the second chamber. "I found them, Thomas. They're all down here together." My blood went cold. Jim had been right behind me when we started climbing. There was no way he could have gotten back down there without me seeing him. "Jim, get back up here right now." "Come down and see, Thomas. It's beautiful. They're all together in the deep water, singing the old songs." That wasn't Jim talking. The voice sounded like him, but the words were wrong. Jim Hawkins was a practical man who never talked about anything being beautiful unless it was his wife's cooking. I was alone on a rope in the middle of a cave that had. It apparently decided to collect my friends. The smart thing would have been to climb out, call for backup, seal the cave entrance. But I'd never left anyone behind, not in 14 years of rescue work. I descended back into the darkness. The second chamber was empty when I reached it. No equipment circle, no lantern, no sign that anything strange had happened. Just bare stone and 3 tunnel mouths leading deeper into the mountain. But the singing continued. Fainter now, coming from the deepest tunnel, the one that led to the underground river system where we'd always warned cavers not to go alone. I followed the sound. The tunnel sloped steeply downward, requiring careful footwork to avoid falling. My headlamp beam showed familiar limestone walls, but the strange symbols were everywhere now, carved deep into the rock, spiraling around the tunnel in patterns that made my eyes water if I looked too long. The air got colder as I descended. Soon I could hear running water ahead, the underground river that flowed through the deepest part of the cave system. We'd mapped maybe half of it before deciding it was too dangerous for regular cave tours. The tunnel opened into a vast underground chamber I'd never seen before. My light couldn't find the far walls or ceiling. It just disappeared into darkness that seemed to go on forever. The river ran through the middle of the space, black water moving fast towards some unknown destination. And standing in the shallow water near the shore were 4 figures: Jim Hawkins, Dave Morrison, Frank Morrison, Pete Kowalski, all of them staring at me with eyes that reflected my headlamp beam like an animal's. "You came," Dave said. His voice echoed strangely in the huge chamber. "We hoped you would." "We've been waiting so long," added Jim. "Down here in the deep water, learning the old songs." I played my light across their faces. They looked normal except for the eyes. Too bright, too reflective. And they were all soaking wet, even though they stood in only ankle-deep water. "Jim, what happened? How did you get down here? So fast!" "Time works differently in the deep places," he said. "We've been here for days, or maybe years. It's hard to tell." "The water sings," Frank Morrison added. "Listen." I did listen, and I could hear it. The river itself was making sound. Not just the splash and gurgle of flowing water, but actual notes. A melody that seemed almost familiar, like a song I'd heard in childhood but couldn't quite remember. "You need to come with us now," Dave said. "The deep ones have been waiting to meet you." "Who are the deep ones?" "The first voices," Pete answered. "The ones who spoke before words were invented. They live in the water, in the deep places under the mountain. They're very old and very lonely." The 4 figures started walking toward me through the shallow water. Their movements were strange, too fluid, like they were floating just above the surface instead of walking on the bottom. "They want to add your voice to the song, Thomas," Jim said. "You have a strong voice. It will make the song more complete." I backed toward the tunnel entrance, but when I turned around, it wasn't there anymore. Just solid rock wall covered in carved symbols. "Where's the tunnel?" "The cave decides who leaves and who stays," Dave explained. "It's been deciding for a very long time. Look at the walls." I raised my light and saw what he meant. The symbols weren't just carved into the stone. They were names and dates going back centuries. Cherokee names from before the settlers came, colonial names from the 1700s, Civil War soldiers, miners from the coal boom, hikers and cavers from recent decades, all of them preserved in stone, all of them part of whatever lived in the deep water. "It doesn't hurt," Frank Morrison said gently. "The water is warm once you go under, and the singing is so beautiful." The 4 figures were close now, close enough that I could see water dripping from their clothes and hair, close enough to see that their eyes weren't quite the right color anymore, too dark, like looking into deep wells. "Just step into the water, Thomas," Jim said. "Let it take your voice down to the deep ones. They'll keep it safe forever." I felt my feet moving toward the water without my permission, like the cave floor was tilting me forward. The black river looked warm and inviting. The singing was getting louder, more beautiful. Maybe it wouldn't be so bad to join the song, to let the deep ones add my voice to their collection. But then I remembered something my grandmother used to say, back when I was a kid, and she filled my head with mountain folklore I'd spent decades trying to forget. Never trust voices calling from deep places. They're not trying to save you. They're trying to steal what makes you human. I forced myself to stop walking. "No," I said. "I'm not going in the water." The four figures stopped smiling. "You have to," Dave said, and now his voice carried an edge of something that wasn't human. "The Deep Ones chose you. They've been calling your name in the water songs for years, waiting for you to come down and join them." I said no. The chamber began to shake. Rocks fell from somewhere high above, splashing into the Black River. The water level started rising, moving up from ankle deep to knee deep in seconds. "The cave is angry," Jim warned. "It doesn't like to be refused." The water kept rising. Soon it would be up to my waist, then my chest. I was trapped in a chamber with no visible exit, and the only way out seemed to be surrendering to whatever lived in the deep water. But I'd spent 14 years getting people out of impossible situations. I wasn't about to give up now. The water reached my waist and kept rising. In minutes, it would fill the chamber completely. I had to find another way out or join my friends in their underwater song. "There has to be another tunnel," I said, playing my light across the walls frantically. "There is no other way," Dave Morrison replied. His voice was changing, becoming deeper, older. "Only down, into the deep water where the first voices wait." But caves always had multiple entrances. Water had to flow in from somewhere, and it had to flow out. I followed the river current with my light and saw something the others had been blocking from view. A narrow opening near the ceiling, just wide enough for a person. The water was flowing toward it, which meant it led somewhere. The only problem was reaching it. The water was already chest deep and rising fast. "You see it now," Jim said. "But you can't reach it without going under, and once you go under, the Deep Ones will have you." "The Deep Ones have been very patient," Frank added, "but their patience is ending." I could feel something moving in the water around my legs. Not fish, something bigger, more deliberate. Whatever lived down here was getting ready to make sure I stayed. "Tell me something," I said, stalling for time while I figured out how to reach that opening. "If you're really my friends, tell me something only they would know." Dave Morrison smiled, but it wasn't his smile anymore. "We are your friends, Thomas. We know you've been a ranger for 14 years. We know you specialize in cave rescue. We know you never believed the old mountain stories. Anyone could know that. Tell me something personal." Jim Hawkins stepped closer through the rising water. "We know you became a ranger to escape the coal mines. We know you're afraid of ending up like your father, coughing his lungs out in some company town." That was closer, but still not personal enough. "What did Jim tell me about his wife last month? Something he was worried about?" The thing that looked like Jim hesitated. "His wife, she was—" "You don't know," I said. "Because you're not Jim. You're just something that's learned to copy voices." The four figures stopped pretending to be human. Their faces went blank. Their eyes turned completely black, and when they spoke, it was in unison with a voice like grinding stone. "We are the collectors of voices. We are the keepers of words. We have been here since before your kind learned to speak. Give us your voice willingly, or we will take it." The water reached my shoulders. I had maybe 30 seconds before the chamber filled completely. "I know what you are," I said, backing toward the wall beneath the opening. "Cherokee stories talk about voice stealers, spirits that punish people who break sacred oaths or betray trust." The four figures began moving through the water toward me, no longer pretending to walk. They flowed like currents themselves. "You were bound here to punish oath breakers, but you got hungry, didn't you? Started taking anyone who came down here, guilty or not." "Guilt or innocence matters not," they replied in that grinding voice. "All voices belong to us in the end." The water reached my neck. I had one chance. "I broke an oath once," I said. "When I was 17, I promised my best friend I'd help him get out of the mines. Instead, I left for ranger training and never came back. He died in a cave-in 3 years later." The voice stealers stopped moving. "I've carried that guilt for 20 years, I continued. "Maybe that's why you called me here. Maybe that's why you wanted my voice for your collection." The water was at my chin now, but it had stopped rising. You want to punish oath breakers? Then listen to this oath. I swear I will never leave another person in a cave again. Not ever. I will keep this promise until the day I die, and beyond if possible. The grinding voice became uncertain. Oaths, sworn in deep water, cannot be broken. Then you can't take my voice, I said, because I needed to keep the oath. I needed to call out to people who are lost in dark places and bring the yawn. Come home. The four figures began to lose their human shape, becoming dark currents in the rising water. But if you let me go, I continued, I'll do something for you. I'll make sure this cave is sealed. No more innocent people will wander down here. You can go back to your original purpose, waiting for the ones who truly deserve punishment. The voice stealers considered this. The water level dropped slightly. And I'll remember their names, I added, looking at the symbols carved into the walls. Dave Morrison, Frank Morrison, Pete Kowalski, Jim Hawkins. I'll make sure people know they died trying to help others, not that they just disappeared. The water dropped to chest level, then waist level. You will remember their names. The grinding voice was fading, becoming distant. I will. I promise. The fake Jim Hawkins was the last to dissolve back into dark water. Before he vanished completely, he spoke in his real voice, confused, frightened, but human. Thomas? What happened to us? Where are we? You're going home, Jim, I said. Tell the others I'm sorry. I couldn't get to you in time. The chamber went silent, except for the sound of water flowing toward the opening near the ceiling. The level had dropped enough that I could climb up and squeeze through. I found myself in a narrow passage that led upward through the limestone. My light showed natural handholds in the rock, and fresh air told me I was heading toward the surface. 20 minutes later, I emerged from a crack in the hillside about half a mile from the main cave entrance. The fog had lifted, and afternoon sunlight felt like a blessing on my face. The official report said the cave system beneath Dark Hollow Falls suffered a geological collapse due to recent heavy rains. 4 experienced cavers were lost in the incident. The cave entrance was permanently sealed with concrete and steel barriers. I never mentioned the voice stealers or what really happened in the deep water. Who would believe it? Instead, I wrote about unstable rock formations and dangerous water levels. The famillas. Lies got their closure. The Park Service got their safety protocol, and the cave got its peace. But some things changed that day in ways the official report couldn't capture. My voice, for instance. It's different now. Deeper, with strange echoes that other people notice but can't quite place. When I call out during rescues, my voice carries farther than it should, reaches places sound normally couldn't go. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the quiet caves we use for training, I hear whispers in the darkness. Not threatening anymore, more like old friends saying hello. The voice stealers kept their bargain. They've gone back to their original purpose, waiting in the deep water for the ones who truly deserve to lose their voices. I kept my promise, too. Every year on the anniversary, I visit the sealed cave entrance and read the names aloud. David Morrison, age 34, died trying to help others explore safely. Frank Morrison, age 31, never left anyone behind. Peter Kowalski, age 28, always the first to volunteer for difficult climbs. James Hawkins, age 40, my partner and friend. The voice stealers remember them now as heroes instead of victims. That seems important somehow. I've been to other caves since then, all across the Appalachian range, and I've learned to listen more carefully to the old stories. Mountain folk have been dealing with things in deep places for generations. Their warnings aren't just superstition. They're survival guides passed down by people who learned the hard way what lives in the darkness under the earth. Last month, I got a call about missing hikers near a cave system in West Virginia. The local rangers said they could hear voices calling for help from multiple directions underground, but the acoustics didn't make sense. I told them to seal the entrance and find another way in. Some voices aren't meant to be followed, and some promises, once more, in deep water, have to be kept forever. If you ever find yourself in a cave and hear someone calling your name from the darkness ahead, remember this. Stop and listen carefully. Is it Really someone who needs help, or is it something that needs what makes you human? The difference might save your life, or at least it might save your voice. My name is Jackson Flintridge, and I've been a forest ranger for 19 years. I've tracked every dangerous animal in these North Georgia mountains. Black bears, wild boars, even the occasional mountain lion that wanders down from the Smokies. I was an Army Ranger before this job, spent time in places where things tried to kill me every day. Point is, I know the difference between what's real and what's just campfire stories. The Cherokee folks around here tell tales about Blood Mountain. They say it's cursed, that warriors died there long ago defending their sacred places. They talk about Kekla Kudla, the stone heart bear, some kind of monster that guards the mountain. I always nodded politely when the old-timers shared these stories, but I never believed them. Bears are bears. Big, dangerous sometimes, but still just animals. That was before August of 1987. The heat that summer was like nothing I'd ever felt. The drought had been going on for 3 months. Streams that usually ran year-round were just cracked mud. The forest was so dry that every step sounded like breaking bones. Animals were acting strange. Deer coming down to the roads looking for water. Bears getting into garbage more than usual. Blood Mountain sits at 4,458 feet, the highest peak in the Chattahoochee National Forest. It's 25 miles from the nearest town, connected only by old logging roads that most folks don't even know exist. No cell phone towers reach that far back. When you're up there, you're truly alone. I was stationed at the ranger office in Dahlonega when the first call came in. A hiker had found what was left of a campsite near the mountain's base. The family that had been camping there was, well, let's just say we needed dental records to identify them. The investigating officer said it looked like a bear attack, but he seemed shaken up about something. Jackson, he told me over coffee at the diner, I've seen bear attacks before. This wasn't normal. The claw marks on the trees, they were 15 feet up, and they went deep into the oak bark, like the thing was marking territory. I drove out to look at the scene myself. The campsite was destroyed in a way that didn't make sense. A cooler had been thrown 40 feet and was embedded in a tree trunk. The car, a full-size pickup truck, had claw marks scraped along the driver's side that went all the way through the metal. But what bothered me most was the silence. Usually the forest is full of sounds, birds, insects, squirrels chattering. This place was dead quiet. Even the wind seemed afraid to make noise. I measured the claw marks, 8 inches from top to bottom, and they went 2 inches deep into solid granite. I'd seen plenty of bear sign in my time, but the biggest black bear leaves maybe 4-inch claw marks, and they can't scratch stone like that. My supervisor assigned me to track whatever had done this. Probably just a big boar got into some trash and went crazy, he said. Take the tranquilizer rifle, find it, and move it somewhere else. I packed my gear that evening: rifle, tranquilizer gun, camping supplies, and my emergency radio. I'd planned to stay out there until I found the animal responsible. I figured it would take maybe 2 days. I should have known better. The Cherokee don't tell stories about places like Blood Mountain without good reason. I hiked up to Blood Mountain just after sunrise, following the old Cherokee trail that winds through thick rhododendron bushes and rocky outcrops. The drought had made the usually green forest look brown and dead. My boots crunched through dry leaves that should have been soft and silent. About halfway up the mountain, I found the first set of tracks. They were in a dried-up creek bed where the mud had baked hard as concrete. Bear tracks, but wrong somehow. They were huge, bigger than any black bear I'd ever seen. But that wasn't the strangest part. The front paws showed what looked like thumbs. Not the little stub that bears sometimes have, but actual opposable thumbs, like a person's hands. I knelt down and put my hand next to one of the prints for scale. The paw print was easily twice the size of my whole hand, including fingers. "What the hell?" I muttered, taking photos with my camera. The pictures would prove I wasn't imagining things. I followed the tracks for about a mile. They led in a straight line up the mountain, but every few hundred yards, there were trees that had been marked. long scrapes in the bark, always on the side facing downhill, like something was leaving messages for anything that might follow. Around noon, I stopped to eat lunch near a big boulder that offered some shade. That's when I heard it. A sound like a cross between a roar and a scream coming from somewhere higher up the mountain. It was answered by another call from a different direction, then another. 3 of them, at least. Bears don't usually travel in groups except for mothers with cubs, and I'd never heard a bear make a sound like that. It was too intelligent. Too much like communication. I packed up my lunch and kept climbing, but now I had the tranquilizer rifle ready in my hands instead of slung over my shoulder. The trail got steeper as I climbed higher. Blood Mountain is all rocky ledges and thick patches of mountain laurel that make it hard to see more than 20 feet in any direction. Perfect place for something big to hide. I was pushing through a particularly thick patch of bushes when I smelled it. A scent like wet dog mixed with something wild and musky. Fresh scent, maybe minutes old. That's when I noticed the silence again. No birds, no insects, nothing. Just my own breathing and heartbeat. I froze, listening. Somewhere behind me a stick broke. I turned around slowly, rifle ready. Nothing there but empty forest. But the feeling of being watched was so strong it made my skin crawl. Another stick broke, this time to my left. Then another to my right. "Okay," I said out loud, mainly to hear my own voice. "Just a curious bear. I'll make some noise and it'll move along." I banged my rifle butt against a tree trunk 3 times. In the echo of the sound, I heard something that made my blood go cold. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps that stopped right after my banging stopped. Something had been walking toward me and had frozen when I made noise. Bears don't walk like that. Bears lumber and crash through the underbrush. This sounded like something trying to be quiet, trying to sneak up on me. I backed up slowly, keeping the rifle pointed toward where I thought the sound had come from. My finger was on the trigger, ready to shoot the tranquilizer dart. That's when I saw it, just for a second. A massive dark shape moving between the trees about 50 yards uphill from me. It was walking on 2 legs, like a person, but it was at least 8 feet tall and covered in dark fur. When it realized I had seen it, it dropped down to all 4s and disappeared into the thick bushes so fast I almost thought I'd imagined it. But I hadn't imagined the smell or the footsteps or the way every instinct I had was screaming at me to run. I made it back to my truck as the sun was setting. My hands were shaking as I tried to start the engine. Whatever was up on Blood Mountain, it wasn't just a big bear. It was something that walked like a man, but moved like an animal. Something that was smart enough to track me without being seen. I drove straight to the Cherokee Reservation and asked to speak with Robert Standing Bear, the eldest man in the tribe. If anyone would know about the old stories, it would be him. He listened to my description without saying a word. When I finished, he nodded slowly. "Kekla Kudla," he said quietly. "The Stod, Nahart Bear. We told you white folks to stay away from that mountain, but you never listen." "What exactly is Kekla Kudla?" I asked. "A warrior who broke sacred laws. The spirits turned him into a bear, but left his human mind intact. He guards that mountain now, protecting it from anyone who would harm it." I wanted to argue, to explain that there had to be a rational answer. But I kept thinking about those thumbs on the paw prints and the way the thing had walked upright before dropping to all 4s. "How do you kill something like that?" I asked. Robert's eyes got hard. "You don't kill a guardian, Mr. Flintridge. You respect it, or you stay away." But 3 more people had died, and it was my job to stop it. I went back up Blood Mountain the next morning with different gear. Along with the tranquilizer rifle, I brought my hunting rifle, a 30-06 that could drop a 600-pound black bear with 1 shot. I also brought my old military compass and a GPS unit, plus extra batteries for everything. The first weird thing happened about a mile up the trail. My compass started spinning like a top, unable to find magnetic north. The GPS showed my elevation as 8,000 feet, which was impossible. Blood Mountain's peak is only 4,458 feet high. I figured it was interference from some kind of mineral deposit in the rocks. Lots of mountains have iron ore that can mess with electronic equipment, But then I found the second campsite. This one was fresher, maybe attacked the night before. A family from Atlanta, according to their car registration. They'd been camping in a clearing about 2 miles from the peak. What I found there made me sick to my stomach. Their tent had been shredded, but not randomly. The cuts were precise, like something with very sharp claws had carefully opened it up to get at what was inside. The camping chairs were arranged in a circle around their dead campfire, like something had sat in them after the attack. Most disturbing of all, rocks and sticks had been arranged in patterns around the campsite. Spirals and lines that looked almost T-like writing. Like whatever did this was trying to leave a message. I took pictures of everything, then followed the tracks leading away from the site. They went straight up toward the peak of Blood Mountain, but every few hundred yards there were more of those stick and rock patterns, markers, like trail signs pointing the way. It was leading me somewhere specific. The tracks led to a cave entrance I'd never noticed before, hidden behind a curtain of mountain laurel. The opening was about 8 feet high and completely black inside. The smell coming out of it was overwhelming. That same wild, musky scent I'd smelled the day before, but much stronger. I clicked on my flashlight and pointed it into the cave. The beam revealed a tunnel that went back farther than my light could reach. But what I saw in that first 20 feet made me back away from the entrance. Bones. Lots of them. And not all of them looked like they came from animals. I was taking pictures of the cave entrance when I heard breathing behind me. Slow, deliberate breaths, like something big trying to stay quiet. I spun around with my rifle ready, but there was nothing there. Just empty forest and the feeling of being watched. "I know you're there," I called out. "Show yourself." The breathing stopped. The silence stretched out for maybe 30 seconds. Then from the trees uphill from me came a sound that made every hair on my body stand up. Laughter. Deep, rumbling laughter that sounded almost human, but not quite. Something was playing with me. I started backing down the trail, keeping my rifle pointed uphill. I'd gotten maybe 50 yards when I heard branches breaking behind me. I spun around to see a massive shape moving through the trees, keeping pace with me as I retreated. It was following me, but staying just out of clear sight. Every time I stopped, it stopped. When I started moving again, it started moving. This went on for over a mile. Whatever was tracking me was smart enough to use the thick forest for cover, but it wanted me to know it was there. It was herding me, keeping me moving in the direction it wanted me to go. I realized I wasn't going back to my truck. I was being driven deeper into the forest, toward parts of Blood Mountain I'd never explored. The sun was getting low when I finally saw it clearly. I'd stopped to rest near a rocky outcrop, and it stepped out from behind a tree about 100 yards uphill from me. It was at least 12 feet tall when standing upright. Its fur was dark brown with silver streaks like an old bear, but its body was wrong. Too lean, too muscular. Its front paws definitely had thumbs, and it held them like hands rather than paws. But the worst part was its eyes. They were intelligent. Human intelligent. It looked at me with the calculating stare of something that was thinking, planning. It tilted its head, studying me like I was a puzzle it was trying to solve. Then it opened its mouth and spoke. Not words exactly, but sounds that had the rhythm of speech. Like it was trying to talk, but couldn't quite remember how. I raised my rifle and aimed right at its chest. At that distance, I couldn't miss. "Stay back," I yelled. "I don't want to hurt you, but I will if I have to." It made that laughing sound again. Then it turned and walked away, moving upright like a person, until it was out of sight. I spent that night in my truck at the base of the mountain, doors locked, rifle across my lap. I didn't sleep much. Every time I started to doze off, I'd hear something moving around outside. Footsteps circling the truck, branches scraping against the windows. When morning came, I found paw prints in the dirt all around my vehicle. It had been out there all night, watching me. But that wasn't the most disturbing thing I found. Scratched into the dirt next to the driver's door were symbols. The same kind of patterns I'd seen at the campsite. Spirals and lines that looked almost like writing. Whatever this thing was, it was trying to communicate. And it had followed me down from the mountain to do it. Robert Standing Bear had been wrong about one thing. This wasn't just a guardian protecting the mountain. It was hunting me personally. On the third day, I hiked up to Blood Mountain's peak alone. I'd called for backup, but the sheriff said he couldn't spare any men for bear problems. He told me to handle it myself or call in the state wildlife department. The state boys would take weeks to respond, and more people would die while I waited. This thing had killed at least 6 people that I knew of, and it was getting bolder. The rock patterns it left behind were getting more complex, more detailed. It was trying to tell me something, and I was pretty sure I didn't want to hear it. The peak of Blood Mountain is a rocky clearing with views of the whole northern Georgia mountains. The Cherokee consider it sacred ground. They say warriors came here to speak with spirits and prepare for battle. I reached the summit just as the sun was setting. Storm clouds were building to the west, and the air felt heavy with electricity. Lightning flickered in the distance, though the thunder was still too far away to hear. I didn't have to wait long. It came up from the south side of the mountain, moving upright like a man, but with the easy grace of something that belonged in the wild. In the dim light, I could see details I'd missed before. Its fur was scarred in places, marked with old wounds that looked like they'd come from fights with other large animals, or maybe other creatures like itself. It stopped about 30 feet away from me and sat down on its haunches, watching me with those intelligent eyes. We stared at each other for maybe 5 minutes. The storm was getting closer. I could hear thunder rumbling in the distance. Then it spoke. Not the half sounds I'd heard before, but actuate. All words in what sounded like Cherokee. I don't speak Cherokee, but I knew someone who did. Robert Standing Bear had taught me a few phrases when I'd first started working in the forest. The use thing was saying something that sounded like a shocky, enemy, or stranger. "I'm not your enemy," I said, though I kept my rifle ready. "I just want the killing to stop." It tilted its head and made a sound that might have been laughter. Then it spoke again, mixing Cherokee words with broken English. "You come, sacred place. You not understand." Its voice was deep and rough, like someone who hadn't talked in years, but the words were clear enough. "Then help me understand," I said. "Tell me what you want." Lightning flashed overhead, and in that brief moment of bright light, I saw something that changed everything. Around the creature's neck was a cord with what looked like military dog tags hanging from it. "You were a soldier," I said. "Like me." It nodded slowly. Then it stood up to its full height, easily 12 feet tall, and began to change. Not physically. It stayed the same massive, bear-like creature, but the way it held itself changed. The way it moved. Suddenly it wasn't moving like a wild animal anymore. It was moving like a soldier. It began to circle me, and I recognized the movement pattern. It was using infantry tactics, trying to get behind me while staying out of my line of fire. This thing had military training. "Vietnam?" I asked, turning to keep it in sight. Another nod. "Cherokee Regiment, Special Forces?" It stopped moving and looked directly at me. Then it spoke more clearly than before. "Staff Sergeant, Joseph, Crow Feather, 1st Battalion." The name hit me like a punch to the gut. I'd heard of Joseph Crow Feather. He'd been reported missing in action in 1968, somewhere in the mountains along the Vietnamese border. They'd never found his body. "How long have you been up here?" I asked. "Since I came home," it said. "Tried to purify myself. Old ways. Broke. Sacred laws." Thunder crashed overhead, and rain started to fall, heavy drops that turned the rocky ground slippery. What sacred laws? It moved closer, and I could see tears in those 2 human eyes. Killed innocents, civilians, children. Its voice broke. "Cannot live with what I did. Came here to ask spirits for death." I was beginning to understand. Joseph Crow Feather had come home from Vietnam carrying guilt that was eating him alive. He'd come to Blood Mountain, a sacred place where Cherokee warriors had always come to deal with spiritual problems. But instead of finding peace, something had happened to him. The spirits changed you, I said. Punishment, it said. Cannot die, cannot live, trapped between. Lightning struck somewhere close by, and the whole mountain shook with thunder. In the flash of light, I could see that the creature was crying. You want me to kill you, I realized. Need warrior's death, honorable combat, only way to break curse. It dropped to all fours and began moving toward me, but slowly, giving me time to raise my rifle. You could have killed me any time in the last 3 days, I said. You've been trying to get me to fight you. Need worthy opponent, another warrior. You understand? Honor. I aimed my rifle at its chest. At this distance, even if the .30-06 couldn't kill it, the impact would hurt. But looking into those tortured eyes, I understood what Robert Standing Bear had meant about respecting the Guardian. I won't murder you, I said, lowering the rifle. But I'll fight you fair and square, hand to hand. If you beat me, you'll have earned your warrior's death. If I beat you, maybe we can find another way to break the curse. The creature that had been Joseph Crow Feather considered this. Then it nodded and stood upright. Thunder crashed again as we faced each other in the pouring rain, 2 soldiers separated by 20 years and a curse that defied explanation, about to fight on sacred ground. I set my rifle aside and drew my hunting knife. It wasn't much against something that size, but it was the closest thing to an honorable weapon I had. The creature nodded approvingly, then rushed me. The fight lasted maybe 10 minutes, but it felt like hours. Joseph Crow Feather in his cursed bear form was incredibly strong, but he fought like a man, not an animal. He used wrestling moves and tactical positioning instead of just trying to tear me apart with his claws. I managed to cut him several times with my knife, and he bled red blood that looked entirely human. But every wound healed almost instantly. The curse wouldn't let him die no matter how much damage he took. Finally, we both collapsed from exhaustion, sitting in the mud and rain about 10 feet apart. He was breathing hard, and I could see the pain in his eyes wasn't just physical. Can't be killed, he gasped. Tried many times. There has to be another way, I said. Robert Standing Bear told me the spirits made you a guardian. Maybe they'll let you go if you've done your job well enough. He looked confused, so I explained. You've been protecting this mountain for almost 20 years, keeping people away who might harm it. Maybe that's enough. Maybe you've paid your debt. Lightning struck the peak above us, so close I could feel the electricity in the air. In that flash of light, other shapes appeared on the mountainside, transparent figures in Cherokee clothing, warriors and elders, watching us. Joseph saw them too. He stood up slowly and began speaking in Cherokee, his voice clear for the first time since I'd met him. The spirits answered in voices like wind through the trees. I couldn't understand the words, but I could feel the weight of judgment in them. The conversation went on for several minutes. Finally, Joseph turned to me. They say, 20 years of faithful service, enough to balance the evil I did. So you're free? I can choose, he said. Stay as guardian, or pass on to a next world. What do you want to do? He looked out over the mountains, then back at the spirit figures surrounding us. I'm tired, he said simply. So very tired. He walked to the center of the peak and knelt down, facing east toward the rising sun. The spirit figures moved closer, forming a circle around him. Thank you, he said to me, for giving me chance to die. As a warrior. Light began to glow around him, starting soft but getting brighter. The massive bear form started to fade, and for just a moment I could see the man he'd been underneath, a young Cherokee soldier in jungle fatigues, finally at peace. The light flashed once, bright as the lightning, and when it faded, Joseph Crow Feather was gone. All that remained was a set of dog tags lying in the mud. I picked them up and read the name, Crow Feather, Joseph M., followed by his service number and Cherokee Nation. The storm was clearing, and the first light of dawn was breaking over the mountains. The spirits were gone too, but I could feel something different in the air. The mountain felt peaceful for the first time since I'd started coming up here. I hiked back down to my truck and drove straight to the Cherokee Reservation. I gave Robert Standing Bear the dog tags and told him everything that had happened. "He's at rest now," the old man said, holding the tags reverently. "We'll bury these properly, with honor." "What about the attacks? Will they stop?" "Joseph was never the one killing people," Robert said quietly. "He was trying to scare them away, protect them from the real danger on that mountain." "What real danger?" Robert looked at me with dark eyes. "Blood Mountain has more than one guardian, Mr. Flintridge, and the others aren't as merciful as Joseph was. I've been back to Blood Mountain a dozen times since then, but I've never made it all the way to the peak again. Every time I try, I find fresh signs of something large moving through the forest. Claw marks on trees, stick patterns arranged in warnings. Whatever else is up there, it doesn't want visitors any more than Joseph did. But unlike Joseph, I don't think these guardians are looking for redemption." The official report blamed the deaths on an unusually aggressive black bear that appears to have left the area. My supervisor was satisfied, the sheriff was satisfied, and the state wildlife department didn't need to get involved. But I know the truth, and sometimes, late at night when I'm patrolling other parts of the forest, I wonder about the stories the Cherokee tell about other sacred mountains. Places like Brasstown Bald and Mount Yonah, places where other warriors might have gone seeking spiritual cleansing and found something else entirely. The mountains of North Georgia hold secrets older than our history books record. Most of the time, those secrets stay buried. But sometimes, when people push too far into places they shouldn't go, the mountains push back. If you ever find yourself hiking in Cherokee country, pay attention to the stories the old folks tell. They're not just legends, they're warnings. And if you see stick patterns arranged in spirals, or find claw marks too high up on the trees, or notice that the forest has gone completely silent around you, take the hint, turn around, and walk away. Some guardians are more understanding than others. My name is Rebecca Ashgrove, and I've been a ranger on Roan Mountain for 11 years now. People think being a park ranger is all about helping lost hikers and putting out campfires, but up here on the Tennessee-North Carolina border, my real job is protecting something much more fragile, the plants that grow nowhere else on Earth. At 6,285 feet, Roan Mountain has these weird bald spots where no trees grow, just grass and wildflowers stretching out like someone took a giant lawnmower to the top of the world. Scientists call them balds, and nobody really knows why they exist. Cherokee people have their own stories about them, but I'm a botanist with a PhD, not a storyteller. I study the rare plants up here, things with names like Gray's lily and mountain avens that only grow in these high, cold places. My little research station sits right at the tree line where the forest gives way to those mysterious meadows. On clear days, I can see 5 states from my front porch. On foggy days, which is most days, I can barely see my own hands. June of 1982 started out normal enough. I was working on my yearly survey of the rare plant populations, checking to see how they'd survive the winter. The weather had been strange, though, unseasonably cold for June, with frost warnings that had me worried about the delicate alpine flowers. That's when I first noticed the tree. It stood at the edge of Flame Azalea Grove, about a quarter-mile from my station. A massive white oak, probably 8 feet around and tall enough that its top disappeared into the low-hanging clouds. I'd walked past it hundreds of times over the years, but something was different now. The other trees in the grove were leafing out just fine, their new green bright against the gray morning, but this old oak looked tired. I'm trained to spot plant diseases, root rot, fungal infections, insect damage. I can usually tell what's wrong with a tree just by looking at it. But this oak had me puzzled. Its bark looked healthy, thick, and deeply grooved like old oaks should be. No sign of boring insects or cankers. The leaves were the right color, full and green. By every measure, I knew the tree should have been thriving, but something in my gut told me it was dying. I decided to take some samples back to the lab, maybe run some soil tests. As I got closer to the tree, I noticed how quiet it was. No birds singing in its branches, no squirrels chattering. Even the insects seemed to avoid it. The temperature dropped too, like stepping into a basement on a hot day. I knelt down to collect some soil from around the base of the trunk. The earth felt cold under my hands, colder than it should have been even with the weird weather. I filled my sample bags and labeled them, trying to ignore the way the hair on my arms was standing up. That's when I heard it. Crying, soft, like children sobbing in their sleep. I stood up fast, looking around the grove. There was nobody there, of course. The nearest trail was half a mile away, and it was barely 7 in the morning. Who would bring kids up here this early, especially in weather like this? The sound came again, definitely crying, but muffled, like it was coming from underground. I told myself it was just wind in the branches, maybe an animal I didn't recognize. Mountain lions can make sounds like screaming babies when they're hunting. I'd heard that before, but this was different. This sounded human. I packed up my gear quickly and headed back to the station. I had soil samples to analyze, and that would give me something concrete to work with. Science, facts, things I could measure and understand. I didn't sleep well that night. Every time the wind picked up, I thought I heard that crying again. The soil samples made no sense. I ran the tests three times, thinking my equipment was broken. The pH readings were all over the place, acidic in some spots, alkaline in others, sometimes both in the same sample. The temperature readings were even weirder. Soil that I'd collected in direct sunlight was registering as nearly frozen, while samples from shaded areas showed normal temperatures. I called my friend Tom Bradley, a soil scientist at the university. "Tom, I need you to walk me through something. I've got soil samples that are reading impossible numbers." "Define impossible," he said. "I've got samples taken 10 feet apart showing pH differences of nearly 3 points, temperature variations of 20 degrees, and the mineral content." I looked at my notes. One sample shows almost no organic matter, like it's been burned. The sample right next to it shows organic levels off the charts, like something's been composting there for decades. Tom was quiet for a minute. "Rebecca, are you sure you didn't mix up your sample bags?" "I'm sure. I've been doing this for 11 years. "Then I'd say your equipment is broken. There's no natural process that could create that kind of variation in such a small area." But I knew my equipment wasn't broken. I'd calibrated everything that morning. I decided to go back to the tree. If something was affecting the soil chemistry, maybe I could figure out what by looking more carefully at the area around it. I loaded my gear into my backpack, pH meter, thermometer, camera, sample bags, and headed out. The grove was different in the afternoon light. The other rhododendrons and mountain laurels looked healthy enough, but they seemed to be leaning away from the big oak, like they were trying to get as far from it as possible without actually moving. I started a systematic survey, taking measurements every few feet in a grid pattern around the tree. The closer I got to the trunk, the weirder the readings became. It wasn't just the soil. The air temperature was dropping too. By the time I was standing right next to the tree, my thermometer was reading 42 degrees even, though it was nearly 70 everywhere else in the grove. I put my hand against the bark. It felt normal, maybe a little cool, but not freezing like the air around it. The bark had deep grooves and ridges typical for an old white oak. I could see where someone had carved initials years ago, the letters now stretched and distorted as the tree had grown. That's when I realized something strange. The carving looked old, like it had been made decades ago. But the letters were crisp, like they'd been cut recently. I traced one of them with my finger, a J that seemed to have been carved in a child's uncertain hand. More initials appeared as I looked closer. MS and TR and LK. All carved at about the same height, maybe 4 feet off the ground. Child height. "Hello?" I called out. "Is someone there?" My voice seemed to get swallowed up by the tree. No echo, no response. Just that unnatural quiet. I started taking photos of the bark, documenting the carvings. Through the camera viewfinder, I could see more letters that weren't visible to the naked eye. Names carved in Cherokee syllabary that I couldn't read, dozens of them, all around the trunk. Then I saw the face. It was subtle, just the way the bark ridges and shadows fell together, but unmistakably a human face, an old woman's face, lined with age and sorrow. Her eyes seemed to be looking down at the base of the tree, at something I couldn't see. I lowered the camera. The face was gone, just bark patterns again. But in the viewfinder, it was still there. I kept snapping photos, moving around the tree. The face followed me, always looking down at the roots, always with that expression of deep sadness. In some shots, I could swear I saw other faces too, smaller ones, children's faces pressed against the inside of the bark like they were trying to push their way out. The crying started again as the sun began to set. Soft at first, then louder. Definitely children, and definitely coming from somewhere near the tree. I called out again, but got no response. I should have left then, should have packed up my gear and headed back to the station before dark. But I'm a scientist, and scientists don't run from things they don't understand. They investigate. I got down on my hands and knees and started examining the ground around the base of the tree. The soil was softer here, like it had been disturbed recently. I brushed away some leaves and found something that made my blood run cold. A small moccasin, made of worn leather and decorated with tiny beads. It looked old, really old, but it was in perfect condition like it had been buried yesterday. I picked it up with shaking hands. It was sized for a child, maybe 7 or 8 years old. That's when the temperature really dropped. My breath started fogging, and frost began forming on the grass around the tree. In June, in Tennessee. I heard footsteps behind me and spun around. Nobody there, but I could see footprints in the frost. Small ones, bare feet, leading from the tree toward the forest. I grabbed my gear and ran. I couldn't stop thinking about that moccasin. I'd brought it back to the station and put it on my desk where it seemed to watch me while I tried to work. Every time I looked at it, I remembered the faces in the bark and the sound of children crying. I called Mary Sixkiller the next morning. She was a Cherokee elder who sometimes helped the Park Service with historical research. If anyone would know about old burials or sacred sites on the mountain, it would be Mary. Mary, it's Rebecca Ashgrove up on Roan Mountain. I need to ask you about something. The tree, she said before I could continue. I felt cold all over. What? The old oak in the azalea grove. You found it, didn't you? How did you... My grandmother told me someone would find it eventually. She said the tree would call to someone when it was ready. Mary, I don't understand. What tree? What are you talking about? There was a low, long pause. I'll be up tomorrow morning. Don't go back to that tree until I get there. But I couldn't stay away. That afternoon, I found myself walking back toward the grove. I told myself I was just doing my job, checking on the other plants in the area. But really, I needed to see if the tree was still there, if any of it had been real. It was real. The oak stood exactly where it had been, looking just as sick and wrong as before. The temperature around it was even colder now, cold enough that I could see my breath even though it was nearly 80 degrees in the sunshine just 50 feet away. I took more photos, documenting everything I could. The bark faces were clearer now, more defined. I could make out individual features, the old woman's braided hair, the round cheeks of the children. Some of the children looked sick, their faces drawn and thin. I found more items buried around the tree. A small wooden doll, a piece of pottery decorated with geometric patterns, beads that looked like they were made from seeds and shells. All of it old, really old, but perfectly preserved. The crying was constant now, not just at dawn and dusk, but all the time. Sometimes I could make out words in Cherokee, a language I didn't speak but somehow understood. Etsi, which meant mother. Nvi, which meant hurt. I was photographing what looked like a small bowl when I heard something that made me drop my camera. Singing. A woman's voice, singing a lullaby in Cherokee. I looked up at the tree and saw her. She was standing right there, translucent but clearly visible, an elderly Cherokee woman wearing traditional dress. Her face was the same one I'd seen in the bark patterns, lined with age and infinite sadness. She was looking down at the base of the tree, singing softly. Around her feet I could see them. Children. Dozens of them, some sitting, some lying down, all of them looking fucking weak. They were flickering in and out of visibility like heat shimmer, but I could see enough to know they were dying. The woman looked up at me, and her eyes held 200 years of grief. "They're so cold," she said in perfect English. "I've kept them warm as long as I could, but I'm tired now. So very tired." "Who are you?" I whispered. "I was their teacher. When the sickness came, I stayed with them. I couldn't save them, but I wouldn't leave them to die alone." "What sickness?" "The spotted sickness. What you call smallpox. It took nearly all of our children that winter. We buried them here, in the sacred grove, and I stayed to watch over them." The children around her feet were becoming more solid, more real. I could see the pox marks on their faces, the fever in their eyes. Some were so young they could barely walk. Others looked to be maybe 10 or 11. "That was a long time ago," I said. "Time moves differently here. For them, it was yesterday. They're still sick, still scared, still cold. I've been keeping them safe inside the tree, but..." She placed her hand on the trunk, and I saw bark begin to flake away. "I can't hold on much longer." "What happens when you let go?" Her eyes filled with tears. "They'll be lost. Alone. They don't understand death. They only know they hurt and want to go home." One of the children, a little girl with long black hair, reached up toward the woman. "Elsie," she said. "Grandmother. I know, little one. I know you want to go home." The woman looked at me again. "You have to help me. You have to help me let them go. I don't know how. Mary knows. Mary's grandmother was my sister's daughter. She knows the old ways." The grove around us was changing. The other trees were withering, their leaves turning brown and falling. The temperature was dropping fast, and I could see ice forming on the branches. Whatever was happening, it was spreading. "You're killing the forest," I said. "Not by choice. Death follows the children wherever they go. They don't understand how to rest. They only know how to suffer." I backed away as the cold intensified. The children were becoming more solid, more present. Some of them started to stand up, reaching toward me with small hands covered in pox sores. "Help us," they whispered in voices like wind through dead leaves. "We want to go home." I ran again. But this time, I heard them following. Mary Sixkiller arrived before dawn, driving her old truck up the fire road as far as it would go. She was a small woman in her 70s, but she moved through the forest like she belonged there. She carried a leather bag and wore a dress decorated with traditional ribbon work. "Show me," she said without any greeting. I led her to the grove, expecting to have to explain everything. But as soon as we got within sight of the tree, Mary nodded like she'd been expecting exactly what she saw. The oak was dying faster now. Half its leaves had fallen, and the bark was peeling away in long strips. The cold around it had created a circle of death. Brown grass, withered flowers, trees dropping their leaves like it was October instead of June. "Adahi was my great-great-grandmother's sister," Mary said quietly. "She was the children's teacher when the smallpox came. She stayed with them when everyone else fled. She sang to them while they died. She's still here. She's been keeping them trapped, I think, inside the tree." Mary set down her bag and began taking things out of it. Sage bundles, a small drum, several small clay bowls. Not trapped. Protected. She thought she was protecting them. But children's spirits, they need to be properly sent on. They need the ceremony, the prayers, the blessing of their people. Can you do it? I can try, but it won't be easy. They've been here so long they don't remember how to let go. And Adahi, she looked at the tree sadly. She's been holding on to them for 200 years. Letting go will kill her too. We could see them now, even in daylight. The children huddled around the base of the tree, looking up at us with curious, frightened eyes. Adahi stood among them, one hand on the trunk, using her connection to the oak to keep them anchored to the world. "You came," she said to Mary. "I came, grandmother. It's time. They're not ready. They're still sick, still scared. The sickness is gone, grandmother. Their bodies are healed. It's only their spirits that remember the pain. Mary lit the sage bundle and began to sing, a low chant in Cherokee that seemed to resonate in my bones. The children looked toward the sound, curious. Tell them, Mary said to me, in English. Tell them they're safe now. Tell them the sickness is gone. I knelt down so I was at eye level with the children. Up close, I could see they weren't as sick as they'd appeared. The pox marks were fading, and their eyes were becoming clearer. You don't hurt anymore, I said softly. The sickness is gone. You're safe. A little boy, maybe 6 years old, reached out to touch my hand. His fingers felt warm, not cold like I'd expected. Are we going home now? He asked. Yes, you're going home. Mary's singing grew stronger, and she began to beat the small drum in a steady rhythm. Adahi, you have to let them go. You have to let yourself go. I can't. Who will watch over them? Their families are waiting for them on the other side. They're real families. You've done your job, grandmother. You kept them safe until help could come. But now it's time. The tree shuddered and more bark fell away. I could see that the trunk was hollow inside, carved out by 2 centuries of spiritual energy. The children had been living inside it, in a space that existed somewhere between life and death. I'm scared, one of the girls whispered. Mary switched to English. Don't be scared, little one. Death is just another journey. Your mothers and fathers are waiting for you. Your grandmothers and grandfathers who went before. The temperature around the grove began to warm. The ice on the branches melted and green returned to the grass. One by one, the children began to stand up. I can see them, the little boy said, looking at something I couldn't see. I can see my mama. Go to her, Mary said. Go home. The children began to walk away from the tree, not into the forest, but into something else, somewhere else. They flickered like candle flames, and then were gone. All except one. A girl about 10 years old who hung back, looking at Adahi. Come with us, teacher, she said. Adahi shook her head. I have to stay. I have to guard the tree. Why? It was such a simple question, asked with a child's innocent directness. Adahi stared at the girl for a long moment, then looked at the hollow, dying oak. I don't remember. Come with us, the girl said again, reaching out her hand. Adahi looked at Mary, then at me, then back at the child. Slowly she reached out and took the girl's hand. Yes, she said. I think it's time to go home. They walked away together, fading like morning mist. The last thing I heard was Adahi's voice singing a Cherokee lullaby that sounded like peace itself. The oak stood empty now, its hollow trunk like an open doorway to nothing. Then, as we watched, it simply crumbled. 200 years of holding on to the impossible finally caught up with it, and it collapsed into itself, becoming nothing more than a pile of rotting wood. But around the place where it had stood, new growth was already beginning. Tiny green shoots pushing up through the earth, life returning to the grove. The official report listed the oak's death as climate stress exacerbated by age-related decline. I recommended that the grove be designated as a research preserve to protect the unique ecosystem recovering there. I never told anyone what really happened. Who would believe it? But I kept the artifacts I'd found, the moccasin, the beads, the wooden doll. I donated them to the Cherokee Museum with a note about where they'd been discovered. The curator told me they were consistent with items from a late 18th century burial site. Mary and I became friends. After that, she taught me some Cherokee words and told me stories about the old days. She said there were other trees on the mountain, other places where spirits lingered because the proper ceremonies had been forgotten or ignored. The mountain remembers everything, she said. Every death, every birth, every prayer. Sometimes the memories get stuck, and they need help moving on. I stayed on Roan Mountain for another 15 years, eventually becoming the head botanist for the entire state park system. I learned to recognize the signs, places where the temperature dropped for no reason, where animals wouldn't go, where plants grew in impossible patterns. I found 7 more trees over the years. A massive hemlock where a Cherokee warrior had died, defending his village. A twisted pine that held the spirit of a woman who'd frozen to death in a blizzard. Each time, Mary helped me perform the proper ceremonies. Each time, new life followed. Mary passed away in 1997, but before she died, she taught her granddaughter the old ways. Sarah Sixkiller carries on the work now, helping lost spirits find their way home. The grove where the mourning tree stood is healthy now, full of rare plants and singing birds. Botanists come from all over the world to study the unusual biodiversity there. They find it fascinating how many species have returned to an area that was nearly barren just 20 years ago. They don't know that the soil is rich with the ashes of children who finally found peace. I retired from the Park Service in 2000, but I still live on the mountain. Sometimes, when the wind is just right, I can hear singing coming from the forest. Cherokee lullabies carried on the breeze. But they sound happy now, not sad. They sound like home. The Cherokees say that children who die young become helpers, spirits who guide other children through difficult times. I like to think that's true. I like to think those kids are still up there somewhere, not trapped anymore, but free to wander the mountain they loved, keeping other lost souls company until it's time for everyone to go home. And if you ever find yourself on Roan Mountain, if you come across a place where the air feels heavy and the animals won't go, remember this. Respect the dead, especially the children. They've been waiting longer than you can imagine for someone to help them find their way. Some trees remember everything. Some trees hold on to love and loss until someone helps them let go. Listen carefully, and they'll tell you their stories. Just be prepared to help them write the ending. My name is Margaret Ironwood, and I've spent 16 years as a forest ranger in West Virginia's coal country. People think my job is all about campfires and lost hikers. But that's not the truth. Most of my work happens in the dark places where old mines cut into the mountains like infected wounds. I grew up in a coal family. My daddy worked the mines until black lung took him when I was 12. My brothers followed him down into the earth, and one by one, they either died or moved away. I was the first woman ranger in our district, and I earned my place by learning things most folks would rather forget. How to read the signs of a mine ready to collapse, how to detect deadly gases, how to seal shafts so they stay sealed forever. The miners who still worked the active sites would tell stories sometimes. Old stories about voices in abandoned tunnels, about women crying in shafts that had been empty for 50 years. I never believed any of it. When you spend your days dealing with real dangers, methane gas, unstable timber, cave-ins that could bury you alive, you don't have time for ghost stories. That was before Copperhead Ridge. February of 1974 was the coldest winter I'd ever seen. Snow piled up past the windows of my truck, and the temperature dropped to 15 below. The whole forest felt dead, wrapped in ice and silence. That's when the earthquake hit. Not a big one, just enough to shift things underground. Just enough to crack open something that should have stayed sealed. The call came in on a Tuesday morning. My supervisor's voice crackled through the radio static. "Margaret, we need you to check Copperhead Ridge. Seismic activity may have opened the main shaft." I knew that mine. Everyone in the county knew it. 47 men died there in 1923 when a gas explosion tore through the tunnels. The whole complex had been sealed with concrete and steel 50 BCC 1 year ago. Nothing should have been able to open it, but something had. I loaded my truck with everything I'd need. Gas detectors, emergency breathing gear, concrete mix, steel plates. The drive took 2 hours through mountain roads that barely deserved the name. When I finally reached the ridge, I could see the problem right away. The main entrance gaped open like a mouth. Chunks of concrete lay scattered in the snow, and I could see the old steel rails disappearing into the darkness. The opening was big enough to walk through, which meant it was big enough for someone to get hurt. Or worse. I parked my truck and grabbed my equipment bag. The first thing I did was test the air at the entrance. My gas detector should have been screaming warnings about methane or carbon monoxide. Instead, it gave readings I'd never seen before. The temperature gauge showed the air inside the mine was 30 degrees colder than outside, even though that was impossible. That's when I heard it for the first time. A woman crying. The sound drifted up from somewhere deep in the mine, faint but clear. It wasn't the wind. I knew what wind sounded like in old shafts. This was human. This was grief so deep it seemed to come from the mountain itself. I stood at that entrance for 10 minutes, listening. The crying never stopped, never changed. It just went on, like whoever was making it had been weeping for 50 years. "Hello?" I called into the darkness. "Is someone down there? This is Forest Service. I'm here to help." The crying stopped. Silence filled the mine shaft, so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. Then, from somewhere impossibly far below, I heard footsteps. Slow, careful footsteps, like someone walking through the dark, walking toward me. I should have left right then, should have called for backup and waited for the mining safety team. But those footsteps sounded like someone was lost down there, maybe hurt. My job was to help people, even if it meant going into places that scared me. I clicked on my headlamp and stepped into the mine. The air hit me like a slap. It wasn't just cold. It was wrong. It smelled of old coal dust and something else, something sweet and rotten that made my stomach turn. My footsteps echoed off the tunnel walls as I followed the main shaft deeper into the mountain. The old rail tracks were still there, buried under decades of dust and debris. My headlamp beam picked out support timbers that looked ready to collapse and walls that wept with moisture. Every few steps I stopped to check my gas detector, but the readings stayed strange. No dangerous gases, just that impossible cold. I'd gone maybe 100 yards when I saw them. Footprints. Fresh footprints in the dust, leading deeper into the mine. But they were wrong. The dust in this tunnel should have been untouched for 50 years, and these prints looked like they'd been made yesterday. They were small, like a woman's shoes, with a strange shape I didn't recognize at first. Then I realized what I was looking at. The heel prints were deep and narrow, old-fashioned shoes, the kind women wore in the 1920s. "Ma'am," I called out, "can you hear me? I'm a forest ranger. I'm here to help." My voice bounced off the tunnel walls and faded into silence. But somewhere ahead, I heard something move. Something that sounded like fabric rustling, like a dress dragging across stone. I followed the prints deeper into the mine. The main tunnel split into smaller passages, and I had to choose which way to go. The footprints led down the left passage, so that's where I went. My headlamp showed more of the same, rotting timber, crumbling walls, and that dust that should have been undisturbed. That's when I found the first piece of cloth. It was snagged on a broken timber about chest high, like someone had brushed past it in the dark. The fabric was old and faded, but I could still make out the pattern. Small flowers on a background that might have been blue once. It looked like it came from a dress, an old dress, a maternity dress. I stared at that scrap of cloth for a long time, trying to make sense of it. How did fabric from the 1920s end up fresh enough to catch on splintered wood? How were there footprints in 50-year-old dust? The crying started again. This time it was closer, much closer. It echoed from somewhere up ahead, a sound full of such sadness that it made my chest hurt. But there was something else in it now. Urgency. Like whoever was crying was trying to tell me something important. I kept following the prints. The tunnel sloped downward, taking me deeper into the mountain. My headlamp beam seemed weaker somehow, like the darkness was pushing back against it. The walls closed in on both sides until I had to walk single file between them. That's when my equipment started acting up. My gas detector began giving off random beeps, showing readings that made no sense. My radio crackled with static so loud I had to turn it off. Even my headlamp flickered, casting weird shadows that seemed to move on their own. I was maybe 300 yards into the mine when I saw her. Just for a second, at the edge of my headlamp beam. A woman in a long dress, standing with her back to me. Her hair was pinned up in an old-fashioned style, and her dress reached almost to the floor. She stood perfectly still, like she was listening to something I couldn't hear. "Ma'am," I called out, hurrying toward her. "Wait. You need to come with me. This mine isn't safe." But when my light reached the spot where she'd been standing, there was nothing there. Just empty tunnel and that strange cold air. The footprints continued past where I'd seen her, leading even deeper into the mountain. I was starting to understand that something was very wrong with this place. The smart thing would have been to leave, to come back with a full team and proper equipment. But that woman, whoever she was still down there somewhere, still in danger. I kept going. The tunnel opened up into a wider chamber, and that's where I found the rest of it. Scattered across the floor like someone had dropped them while running, more pieces of cloth, an old hair ribbon, and something that made my blood turn cold. A baby's rattle, old and tarnished, but still recognizable. It was covered in coal dust, like it had been down here for decades. I picked it up with shaking hands. The metal was cold enough to burn my fingers, and when I moved it, it made no sound, like whatever was inside had long since turned to dust. That's when the mine started talking to me. From somewhere deeper in the tunnels, I heard voices. Not just the crying woman, other voices, men's voices, calling out words I couldn't quite understand. They sounded far away and muffled, like people shouting through water. But they were getting closer, and they sounded scared. I should have run then. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get out of that mine and never come back. But those voices, they sounded like people in trouble. People who needed help. I clicked on my backup flashlight and kept going deeper. The tunnel system was bigger than I'd thought. Passages branched off in all directions, and I could feel air moving through them like the mountain was breathing. The voices seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing off the walls until I couldn't tell which direction they were coming from. My gas detector had given up entirely, just beeping randomly like it was broken. The cold was getting worse, too. I could see my breath in the beam of my flashlight, and my fingers were going numb even inside my gloves. That's when I met Pete Colson. I found him in a side passage, hunched over a pile of old mining records. He was wearing a hard hat with a carbide lamp, like miners used to wear decades ago. When my light hit him, he looked up with eyes that seemed too bright in the darkness. "You shouldn't be down here," he said. His voice sounded strange, like it was coming from far away. Not with her walking the tunnels again. "Who are you?" I asked, keeping my flashlight trained on him. "How did you get down here?" "Pete Colson," he said, standing up slowly. "I've been researching the 1923 disaster for 30 years. When the earthquake opened the mine, I had to come see for myself." He didn't look like any researcher I'd ever met. His clothes were old, patched in places, and covered with coal dust like he'd been down in the mines for days. But his eyes were sharp and intelligent, and he seemed to know things about this place that I needed to understand. "Tell me about the disaster," I said. Pete laughed, but there was no humor in it. 47 men died when gas ignited in the main shaft. But that's not the whole story. There was a woman down here too, Mary Ellen Guthrie. She was pregnant, hiding in the mine because her husband beat her. When the explosion happened, she tried to save the trapped miners. What happened to her? She died trying, Pete said, but not before she got 3 men out. Crawled through collapsed tunnels, breathed poison gas, did things that should have been impossible. They found her body 3 days later, still trying to dig through a cave-in with her bare hands. The crying started again, closer than ever. It seemed to be coming from the walls themselves now, like the mountain was weeping. "She's still down here," Pete whispered. "Still trying to save people who died 50 years ago. Still doesn't understand that she failed." "She didn't fail," I said. "You just told me she saved 3 men." Pete's eyes went wide. Nobody ever told her that. She died thinking she'd failed them all. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees in the space of a heartbeat. My breath came out in white clouds, and frost began forming on the tunnel walls. From somewhere deeper in, the mine, I heard footsteps again. Lots of footsteps, like a whole group of people walking through the dark. "She's bringing them back," Pete whispered. The miners who died. She thinks if she can gather them all together, she can save them this time. That's when the lights went out. Both my flashlight and headlamp died at the same time, plunging us into darkness so complete it felt solid. I fumbled for my backup light, but before I could find it, the tunnel filled with a different kind of light, a pale, cold glow that seemed to come from the walls themselves. In that ghostly light, I saw them. Dozens of men in mining clothes, their faces black with coal dust, their eyes empty holes in their heads. They moved slowly down the tunnel toward us, their boots making no sound on the stone floor. Behind them, barely visible in the shadows, walked a woman in a long dress. She was crying, and her tears left dark stains on her cheeks. Run, Pete whispered. I ran. I stumbled through the dark tunnels, my hands stretched out to feel my way along the walls. Behind me, I could hear them following. Not just the ghostly miners, but something else. The sound of someone running, someone real and alive, and terrified. The woman in the dress. She was chasing me through the mine, calling out words I couldn't understand. Her voice was desperate, pleading, like she was trying to tell me something important. But I was too scared to stop and listen. The tunnel began to shake. At first it was just a tremor, like another small earthquake. But it got worse quickly. Ceiling beams creaked and groaned, and dust rained down from above. The old support timbers were giving way, and I realized the mine was collapsing. I found a side passage and dove into it just as the main tunnel caved in behind me. Rock and timber crashed down where I'd been standing seconds before, sealing off my escape route. I was trapped. In the silence that followed, I heard her voice again. The crying woman. But this time she was singing. A lullaby, soft and sweet and sad. The kind of song a mother might sing, to calm a frightened child. The singing led me deeper into the mountain, through passages I couldn't see, and over ground that shouldn't have been solid. My flashlight had started working again, throwing weak light on walls that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. I found her in the deepest chamber of the mine. She sat on the floor with her back against a support beam, her hands folded over her swollen belly. In the beam of my flashlight, I could see that she was young, maybe 25, with dark hair pinned back and a face that would have been pretty if not for the exhaustion and fear written across it. She was still crying, but quietly now. Tears ran down her cheeks and dripped onto her dress, leaving dark stains on the faded fabric. "Mary Ellen," I said softly. She looked up at me, and her eyes were the saddest things I'd ever seen. They were the eyes of someone who had lost everything and was still trying to save what couldn't be saved. "I couldn't get them out," she whispered. Her voice was like wind through broken glass. "I tried so hard, but I couldn't get them all out." "You saved 3 men," I said, kneeling down beside her. "Pete told me. You saved 3 men's lives." She shook her head. 47 went in. Only 3 came out alive. I failed them. The mine shuddered around us. Rocks fell from the ceiling, and I could hear water beginning to flow somewhere in the darkness. The flooding had started. Another danger that would make this place even more deadly. "You didn't fail," I said urgently. "You were pregnant and hurt, and you still saved 3 people. That makes you a hero." "A hero would have saved them all." "A hero does what they can with what they have," I said. "Nobody could have saved them all. The gas, the explosion, the cave-in. It was too much for any one person." She looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something change in her eyes. A tiny spark of hope, like a candle flame in the wind. "3?" she whispered. 3, I said firmly. Tommy Walsh, 19 years old. Johnny Brennan, 24. And Sam Morrison, who had 5 kids waiting for him at home. They all lived because of you. Their families got to see them again because you crawled through fire and poison gas to pull them out. The crying stopped. For the first time in 51 years, Mary Ellen Guthrie stopped crying. The mine began to collapse in earnest then. The whole mountain seemed to be coming down around us, but Mary Ellen just sat there, a look of wonder spreading across her face. "I saved them," she said. "You saved them," I confirmed. She smiled then, the first real smile she'd worn since 1923. And as she smiled, she began to fade. Not disappearing exactly, but becoming transparent, like morning mist when the sun hits it. "Thank you," she whispered. "I can rest now." The water was rising fast, already up to my knees. The tunnel behind me was completely blocked, and I couldn't see any way out. But Mary Ellen stood up, solid again, and took my hand. "This way," she said. "I know another way out." A way the miners used when they needed to escape quickly. She led me through passages I never would have found on my own, through places where the rock had shifted and opened new paths. The water followed us, but she seemed to know exactly where to go to stay ahead of it. We climbed up through a shaft I hadn't seen before, a narrow passage that led toward the surface. Behind us, the mine was filling with water and collapsing in on itself, erasing 50 years of secrets. Just before we reached the surface, Mary Ellen stopped. "Will you remember?" she asked. "Will you tell people what really happened here?" "I'll tell them," I promised. "I'll make sure people know about your sacrifice." She nodded and stepped back into the shadows. "Take care of your own children," she said. "Love them while you can." And then she was gone. I crawled out of that mine shaft into the coldest, most beautiful morning I'd ever seen. The sun was rising over the mountains, turning the snow into diamonds, and I was alive when I should have been dead. The Copperhead Ridge mine sealed itself that day. The whole complex collapsed and filled with water, and even if someone wanted to dig it out again, there wouldn't be any point. What needed to be done there was finished. I spent 3 days in the hospital recovering from hypothermia and shock. When I told people what happened, most of them figured I'd hit my head in the collapse and imagined things. Cave-ins can do that to people, make them see and hear things that aren't there. But Pete Colson never came out of that mine. The rescue teams never found his body, and when I asked around, nobody in the county had ever heard of a mining researcher by that name. I think maybe he'd been down there longer than he told me, maybe a lot longer. I went back to work after a week, but something had changed in me. I started researching other mining disasters throughout the region, and what I found made my skin crawl. Similar stories from other abandoned mines, voices in sealed shafts, women crying in places where no women should be. Mary Ellen wasn't the only one still walking the tunnels. I began a new project, working with local communities to create memorials at disaster sites, small monuments with the names of everyone who died and everyone who tried to save them. It's become my life's work now, making sure people remember the sacrifices made in these mountains. Sometimes when I'm working at a new site, I hear them, the voices of people who died trying to help, who are still trying to help. I always stop what I'm doing and say their names out loud, tell them they did enough, that they can rest now. Usually it works, but not always. There are places in these mountains where the grief runs too deep, where the guilt is too strong. Places where people are still trying to save lives they couldn't save 50 years ago. And sometimes, if you listen carefully on quiet nights, you can still hear them crying. That's why I'm telling you this story. If you ever find yourself near an old mine shaft, if you ever hear voices calling from the darkness, remember what I learned in Copperhead Ridge. Some people die trying to save others, and that makes them heroes. But heroes need to be told when their job is done. They need to hear that they did enough. They need permission to rest. And if you're very lucky and very kind, maybe they'll listen to you the way Mary Ellen listened to me. Maybe you can help them find the peace that's been waiting for them all these years. Because that's what heroes deserve. Not to wander forever in the dark, but to step into the light and know they did their best with what they had. That's all any of us can do. My name is William Thornberry, and I've been a park ranger for 13 years. People think that's long enough to see everything these mountains can throw at you. They're wrong. I transferred to Grandfather Mountain back in 1956, fresh out of college with a meteorology degree and big dreams about studying weather patterns in the Blue Ridge. The mountain peak sits at 5,946 feet, and the storms that roll through here are like nothing you'll see anywhere else. Lightning strikes the summit more than any other spot in North Carolina. That's why they built the weather station up there, and that's why they needed someone like me to run it. I've always been a facts and numbers kind of guy. Give me barometric pressure readings and wind speed data, and I can tell you what's coming 3 days out. What I couldn't tell you about, what I never believed in, were the old mountain stories. You know the ones: ghost lights dancing on the peaks, spirits of the Cherokee, witch fires that burn without fuel. Nonsense, all of it. The locals love their tales. Every time I'd come down from the station for supplies, someone would corner me at Morrison's General Store with another story about strange lights up on Grandfather's Peak. Old-timers claimed they'd been seeing them since they were kids. Even had a name for them: witch lights. "You ever see anything odd up there, Ranger Thornberry?" They'd ask, eyes twinkling like they knew some secret I didn't. "Just weather phenomena," I'd always answer. "Ball lightning, maybe some St. Elmo's fire during electrical storms. Nothing a good meteorology textbook can't explain." They'd just smile and nod like they knew better. September of 1969 started different, though. My equipment began registering readings that didn't make sense. The electromagnetic sensors, which normally showed steady patterns broken only by approaching storms, started jumping a rows, and like a seismograph during an earthquake. But there were no storms. The sky was clear, wind calm, barometric pressure stable. I checked and double-checked everything, cleaned the sensors, replaced batteries, even hauled a whole new electromagnetic detection unit up the mountain on my back. Same impossible readings. Energy concentrations that shouldn't exist in nature, at least not without massive electrical activity. The mountain felt different too, though I couldn't put my finger on how. I'd wake up in the weather station and step outside for my morning readings, and something would feel wrong. Not dangerous exactly, just off. Like when you walk into a room and know someone was just talking about you, but you can't prove it. My radio started acting up around the same time. Instead of the usual Park Service chatter and emergency channels, I'd pick up fragments of conversations that didn't belong. Old-fashioned words, formal speech patterns. Once I swear I heard someone talking about gathering herbs by moonlight and protecting the innocent from false accusations. I blamed solar interference. Had to be. The sun goes through cycles of increased electromagnetic activity, and that can mess with radio signals something fierce. But deep down, I knew this was different. These weren't random bursts of static. They were voices, clear as day, speaking in English so old it sounded almost like a foreign language. That's when I started seeing the lights. The first one appeared on a Tuesday evening, just as the sun was setting behind the western peaks. I was outside taking wind measurements when something caught my eye near the summit's edge. A soft bluish glow about the size of a basketball, hovering 3 feet off the ground. My first thought was someone had left a camping lantern up there, though how they'd gotten past the restricted access signs was beyond me. I head out, thinking maybe some hiker was lost and needed help. "Hello, you okay over there?" The light flickered, almost like it heard me. Then it started moving. Now I've seen ball lightning. Before. Survived a strike back in '63 that left me unconscious for 6 hours and my left arm numb for a month. Ball lightning moves erratically, bouncing around like a soap bubble in the wind. This light moved with purpose. It drifted toward me slowly, deliberately, like someone carrying a lantern across rough ground. When it got within 20 feet, I could see it wasn't any kind of lantern. The glow came from inside, a cold blue radiance that didn't illuminate anything around it. No heat signature, no visible source, just pure light hanging in the air like morning mist. I reached for my radio to report what had to be some kind of atmospheric phenomenon. That's when the light stopped moving and pulsed 3 times, bright as a camera flash. My radio crackled to life. "They know not what they do," came a woman's voice, clear and sad. "The innocent suffer for the fears of ignorant men." The transmission cut off. The light faded and disappeared. I stood there for 5 minutes, radio in hand, trying to convince myself I'd imagined the whole thing. But the electromagnetic sensors in the station were going crazy, registering energy spikes that peaked right when the voice came through. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that blue glow and heard that woman's voice. The accent was strange, not quite Southern, not quite anything I could place, formal and precise, like people used to talk in old movies. I spent the next morning going through every piece of equipment twice. Everything checked out normal, but when evening came, the lights came back, 3 of them this time, moving in formation about 100 yards from the station. They pulsed in sequence, 1, 2, 3, like they were communicating with each other. My radio picked up more voices, fragments of conversation that made my skin crawl. Justice denied leaves spirits restless. The sea, truth lies buried beneath lies and fear. Mountain remembers what men choose to forget. I started keeping a log. Date, time, weather conditions, electromagnetic readings, radio transmissions. If I was going crazy, at least I'd have documentation. But the readings were real, the voices were clear, and the lights were getting brighter. By the end of the week, they'd started responding to me directly. I'd step outside and they'd appear within minutes. When I'd wave, they'd pulse. When I'd speak, the radio would crackle with answers. Friday night, I worked up the courage to ask a direct question. What do you want? The silence stretched so long I thought they were gone. Then my radio erupted with static, and through the noise came a single word, repeated over and over. Justice. That's when I knew I was dealing with something that had nothing to do with weather patterns or atmospheric electricity. These lights, whatever they were trying to tell me something, and they weren't going to stop until I listened. I drove down to the county library first thing Saturday morning, looking for anything that might explain what was happening on Grandfather Mountain. The librarian, Emma Caldwell, had been there since before the mountain became a state park. If anyone would know the local history, it would be her. Witch lights? She raised an eyebrow when I asked. Now that's not a question I get from park rangers very often. What's got you curious about old mountain stories? I tried to keep it vague. Just some unusual readings up at the station. Thought maybe there was historical context for the local folklore. Emma disappeared into the stacks and returned with an armload of books, county histories, Cherokee legends, even some handwritten journals from the early settlers. Most of it was what I expected. Vague stories about mysterious lights, Indian spirits, unexplained phenomena that had simple scientific explanations. Then Emma pulled out a slim folder marked Caldwell County Court Records, 1782. Now this, she said, opening it carefully, is something most folks don't know about. We had ourselves a witch trial right here in the county, only one in the area's recorded history. The documents were photocopies of handwritten court records, faded and hard to read. But Emma had transcribed the key passages, and what I read made my blood run cold. Margaret McLeod, age 34, charged with witchcraft and trafficking with evil spirits. The accusation came from her neighbors after a series of unexplained illnesses struck their livestock. The trial lasted 3 days. Margaret claimed she was a healer, that she used herbs and traditional remedies learned from Cherokee friends to help sick animals and people. The court didn't believe her. They found her guilty on October 13, 1782, and sentenced her to hang. But the records showed something unusual. Instead of a public execution in town, they took her up to Grandfather Mountain's peak. The reasoning, according to the judge's notes, was that the witch's evil influence might be contained by the sacred nature of the high place, preventing her spirit from returning to trouble the living. She was executed at sunset on October 15, 1782, right where my weather station now stood. Emma, I said, my voice barely steady, what happened after the execution? She flipped to the final page. That's the strange part. 3 days after Margaret McLeod died, the real cause of the livestock illness was discovered. Contaminated feed from a grain merchant who'd been cutting corners. Margaret McLeod was completely innocent. I felt sick. Did anyone try to clear her name? Who was going to admit they'd killed an innocent woman? The records got buried, forgotten. Most people today don't even know it happened. Emma closed the folder. Why are you really asking about this, William? I couldn't tell her about the lights, about the voices on the radio. Instead, I thanked her and headed back up the mountain with copies of every document she'd let me take. That night, the lights were waiting for me. Not 3 or 4 this time, dozens of them, spread across the peak like stars fallen to earth. They pulsed in unison, a slow rhythm like a massive heartbeat. My electromagnetic sensors were registering readings that should have been impossible without a direct lightning strike. I set up my radio and waited. The voice came through clearer than ever before. You know the truth now. It was definitely a woman's voice, with that same formal, old-fashioned accent I'd been hearing all week. But now I could place it. It sounded like the speech patterns from the court transcripts Emma had shown me. Margaret, I said into the radio. The lights flared brighter, and the electromagnetic readings spiked off the charts. Margaret McLeod, innocent of all charges, murdered by fear and ignorance. Thunder rumbled overhead, though there wasn't a cloud in the sky. What do you want from me? Justice denied in life. Truth acknowledged in death. The mountain remembers. Make others remember too. The wind picked up and I felt electricity in the air, like the moment before lightning strikes. Every hair on my body stood on end. I don't know how. The records exist. The truth exists. Speak it. That's when the real storm hit. Not a weather storm. Something else entirely. The lights began moving, swirling around the peak in a pattern that hurt to look at. My radio exploded with voices, dozens of them, all talking at once about injustice, about innocent blood spilled, about wrongs that demanded to be made right. The electromagnetic pulse knocked out every piece of equipment in the station. Emergency power, backup radio, even my flashlight died. The only light came from outside, where Margaret McLeod's spirit danced in the darkness, bright as lightning, and twice as danger. I realized I wasn't just dealing with a ghost story anymore. I was trapped on a mountaintop with the angry spirit of a woman who'd been wrongfully executed, and she wasn't going to let me leave until I promised to clear her name. The storm that hit Grandfather Mountain that night wasn't in any weather forecast. It came out of nowhere, a massive electrical system that turned the peak into the center of the most violent lightning activity North Carolina had ever recorded. But I wasn't watching the lightning anymore. I was watching Margaret. She appeared in the middle of the electromagnetic chaos, not as a ball of light, but as a woman made of pure electrical energy. I could see her face, her clothes, even the rope marks around her neck. She wore a simple dress from the 1700s, and her hair was pulled back in a style I recognized from old portraits. But her eyes burned with almost 300 years of rage and injustice. They called me witch, she said, her voice coming from everywhere at once. The radio, the wind, even vibrating through the metal walls of the weather station. They feared what they did not understand. Lightning struck the summit again and again, each bolt seeming to feed her manifestation. She grew more solid, more real, until I could see every detail of her face, twisted with fury. I healed their children when fever struck. I delivered their babies when no doctor would come to the mountains. I tended their sick animals with herbs the Cherokee taught me to use. Her voice rose with each word, and the lightning strikes came faster. And when their grain merchant poisoned the livestock, they needed someone to blame, someone different, someone alone. Another massive bolt hit so close I felt heat wash over me. In the flash, I saw Margaret step closer, electrical energy crackling around her like a living thing. They dragged me up this mountain in chains, made me kneel at the very spot where your station now stands. The last thing I saw was the sun setting behind those peaks while they put the rope around my neck, and the storm was getting worse. Lightning was striking the summit every few seconds now, and I could smell ozone and burning metal. My weather station was built to withstand electrical activity, but not this. Nothing was built to withstand this. Margaret, I shouted over the thunder, what do you want me to do? Tell the world what really happened. Lightning crashed around us like artillery fire. 3 centuries I have been trapped here, bound to this place by their lies and injustice. 3 centuries of being remembered only as a witch, a danger, something evil to be feared. She was right in front of me now, close enough that I could feel the electrical charge coming off her like heat from a furnace. The metal weather instruments around us started glowing red hot. Make them remember Margaret MacLeod the healer, not Margaret MacLeod the witch. Make them acknowledge the innocent woman they murdered. I will, I said, meaning it. I promise I will. But you're going to kill me if this storm gets any worse. She paused, and for a moment the lightning slowed. I could see something besides rage in her electric eyes. Grief, loneliness, a desperate hope that maybe, finally, someone would listen to her story. You swear it? On your life and honor, you swear to tell the truth? I swear. The change was immediate. The lightning stopped as suddenly as it had started. The electromagnetic readings on my few surviving instruments dropped back to normal levels. Margaret's manifestation began to fade, but her voice remained clear. Then I will hold you to that promise, William Thornberry. And if you break your word, I will return with a storm that makes this one look like summer rain. The mountain fell silent, except for the wind through the trees and the settling sounds of overheated metal cooling down. I was alone on the peak again, but I knew I wasn't really alone. Margaret MacLeod Wabell is still there, waiting to see if I'd keep my promise. And I intended to. It took me 6 months to do it right. I started with Emma Caldwell at the library, showing her my weather data from that night and explaining what I'd experienced. She didn't believe the supernatural part. How could she? But she was fascinated by my interest in clearing Margaret MacLeod's name. Together, we researched everything we could find about the 1782 witch trial. We tracked down descendants of the original judge and jury members, found more court records in the state archives, even located the grain merchants' business ledgers that proved the livestock had died from contaminated feed, not witchcraft. The local historical society agreed to review the case. It helped that I had an impeccable reputation as a park ranger and meteorologist. People trusted me to stick to facts. When I presented the evidence, they agreed unanimously. Margaret MacLeod had been wrongfully executed. On October 15, 1970, exactly 188 years after her death, the Caldwell County Historical Society officially exonerated Margaret MacLeod of all charges of witchcraft. They erected a small memorial plaque at the base of Grandfather Mountain, acknowledging her as a healer and midwife, wrongly accused and unjustly executed. The night after the exoneration ceremony, I was up at the weather station when the lights appeared one last time. Just one this time, soft and blue and peaceful. It hovered near the memorial plaque location for a few minutes, pulsed 3 times like a thank you, and then faded away forever. I never saw the witch lights again. That was 15 years ago. I retired from the Park Service in 1980 but stayed in the area. These days, I volunteer with the Historical Society, helping research other cases of historical injustice in the mountains. You'd be surprised how many people were wrongly accused of things over the centuries. Witchcraft, theft, murder. A lot of innocent folks got buried under lies and fear. I tell Margaret's story to anyone who'll listen. Tour groups, school kids, histories, eye buffs. Most people think it's just another mountain legend, which is fine by me. But sometimes, especially when I'm talking to someone who's been wrongly accused of something themselves, I see recognition in their eyes. They understand that justice delayed doesn't have to mean justice denied. The funny thing is, Grandfather Mountain has become known for its unusual electromagnetic activity. Scientists come from universities all over to study the atmospheric electrical phenomena that occur at the summit. They measure and graph and theorize, but they can't explain why the mountain generates more electrical activity than anywhere else in the region. I could tell them, but they probably wouldn't believe me. The mountain remembers. It remembers Margaret MacLeod the healer, not Margaret MacLeod the witch. And as long as people remember the truth, her spirit can finally rest in peace. But I still keep my weather equipment running up there, just in case. Because there are other mountains in Appalachia, other peaks where innocent people met unjust ends. And if their spirits ever need someone to listen to their stories and help set the record straight, well, I've gotten pretty good at that sort of thing. The witch lights taught me that some storms are worth weathering if it means the truth finally sees the light of day.